The Rocky Mountains stretch across the horizon like a jagged spine, their peaks piercing clouds and shadowing valleys where the unexplained lingers. Across these remote ridges and hidden trails, hikers, families and explorers have vanished without a trace, leaving behind gear, footprints and whispered questions that haunt the wilderness. Some disappearances defy logic, others seem to intersect with legends older than the mountains themselves. Tales of soundless winds, vanishing lodges and ridges that watch. From isolated towers to glacier-hidden secrets, the Rockies conceal mysteries captured in maps, journals and photographs that hint at truths no one has fully uncovered. As each story unfolds in this video, the mountains invite closer scrutiny, urging those who seek answers to look deeper, follow the clues, and confront the riddles that have baffled generations. Alfred Beilharz in Rocky Mountain National Park. The summer of 1938 drew thousands of families to the high meadows and rushing creeks of Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. Among them was the Beilharz family from Denver, who arrived for a quiet weekend of camping near Fall River, just below the Continental Divide. The park was a place of open air and safety, a refuge where children could wade in shallow streams and parents could forget the pressures of the city. Yet by the time the Beilharzes packed to leave, their 6-year-old son, Alfred, had vanished into a silence that has never been broken. That morning began with laughter echoing through this valley as Alfred played by the water with several other children. His father, William, watched from the bank, certain the boy was safe among family. The creek that wound past their campsite was narrow but swift, its current fed by snowmelt from the surrounding peaks. When the children climbed out and began walking back toward camp, Alfred was gone. In those first few minutes, no one felt alarmed. It was easy to imagine he'd run ahead or pause to collect stones along the bank. But within an hour, the calm of the camp turned to confusion as searchers combed the area, calling his name into the rising wind. By late afternoon, rangers had been notified. Dozens of volunteers joined the family, forming lines through the forest, checking every thicket and hollow. The terrain around Fall River is dense and uneven, where pine roots twist through granite soil and boulders hide sudden drops. Dogs were brought in to follow Alfred's scent, but they lost it almost immediately near the stream. Some believed the boy had fallen in and been carried downstream, though others pointed out that no trace of clothing, no footprints, and no signs of struggle were ever found. The creek was shallow enough in most areas that a body would have surfaced quickly. It never did. The following day, more than 100 men spread across the valley. Rangers extended the search to nearby trails, including the steep switchbacks leading toward the Fern Lake area. The air thinned with altitude, and the slopes were littered with rocks slick from morning dew. Despite the effort, the forest gave back nothing. Alfred's disappearance began to attract attention from beyond the park, drawing reporters from Denver and beyond who came to chronicle what was quickly being called one of the strangest vanishings in the park's history. Then came a sighting that deepened the mystery. 5 days after Alfred vanished, a couple hiking near Devil's Nest, a narrow ledge high above the big Thompson River, reported seeing a small boy sitting alone on the rocks. The location was several miles from the Beilharz campsite and at an elevation that few adults could reach without difficulty. The couple described the child as wearing light clothing and looking downward toward the valley. When they called out, he quickly disappeared behind the rocks. Rangers were dispatched to the area, but by the time they reached the ledge, no one was there. The climb was perilous, and many wondered how a 6-year-old could have made it that far through forest and ravine without injury or direction. The Beilharzes clung to the hope that the sighting was genuine. For days afterward, search teams focused on that section of the mountain. They explored ravines, checked every overhang, and even lowered themselves into crevices using ropes. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became, and the fewer clues they found. No tracks, no torn clothing, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Weeks later, rangers discovered a child's sock near an old trail leading toward Mount Chapin, roughly 6 miles from where Alfred disappeared. The fabric was similar to what he had been wearing, but the terrain between the 2 points made it unlikely that a child could have covered that distance unaided. The Beilharzes identified the sock as possibly belonging to their son, yet even that lead evaporated when further searches around the site revealed nothing more. As the weeks passed, the official search dwindled. Rangers continued to patrol, but summer turned toward autumn and the park's visitors thinned. The mountains that had once been filled with picnics and laughter now held only the sound of wind through the trees. The family returned home to Denver without answers. Their son had vanished into one of the most visited parks in America, leaving behind not a single definitive trace. In the years that followed, the case became one of the oldest unsolved disappearances in the park's record. Historians reviewing the incident have pointed out that Alfred's disappearance predated modern search and rescue techniques. There were no helicopters, no thermal imaging, and little coordination between the volunteers and rangers. Yet even by the standards of the time, the lack of physical evidence is extraordinary. No animal tracks suggested a mountain lion attack, and the steep terrain would likely have revealed some sign of a fall. The forest seemed to have erased him. During later archival research, some historians discovered a hand-drawn map in the Baleharts family's papers showing a narrow trail leading from the creek to a hidden alcove near the base of a cliff. The alcove, obscured by dense pines, is inaccessible from the main trails and has been overlooked by all search parties. When modern hikers attempted to locate it, they found a small, weathered depression in the soil, just large enough for a child to crouch in, with faint scrape marks on nearby rocks. No belongings or artifacts remained, yet the site's existence suggested that Alfred might have reached a concealed spot unnoticed by anyone, a possible refuge that could have explained why he was never found, yet still offered no definitive answers. Some park officials later speculated that Alfred may have been abducted by someone passing through the area, though no witnesses recalled seeing strangers near the campsite that day. Others argued that the Devil's Nest sighting may have been a trick of distance or light, perhaps a hiker mistaken for a child. Still, the image of a small figure sitting quietly on a ledge hundreds of feet above the river remained burned into the minds of those who searched. Today, the story of Alfred Baleharts lingers like a shadow across Rocky Mountain National Park. Visitors hiking near Fall River sometimes speak of a strange stillness that falls over the woods as the trail narrows, a hush that feels unnatural even amid the vast quiet of the wilderness. Rangers who study the case say that the park's topography, its cliffs, creeks, and dense forests, can swallow evidence faster than one might believe. Yet the absence of any clue, not even a fragment of clothing or bone, defies explanation. Time seems to warp for those passing through Fall River, producing moments of sudden unease. Trails that feel longer than memory dictates, shadows shifting where none should fall, and the occasional distant sound of a child's laughter or footsteps that vanish when approached. Some swear the wind itself carries whispers through the trees, faint and indecipherable, as if the forest remembers more than it reveals. These fleeting impressions, subtle and easily dismissed, linger in the minds of those who traverse the park, a quiet reminder that Alfred's absence has never truly left the landscape. Somewhere beyond the tree line, where sound fades and trails dissolve into stone, the mountains still seem to hold the echo of a child's name that was never answered. Jared Atadero on Colorado's Big South Trail. The sound of rushing water filled the canyon as the group made their way along the Big South Trail, a narrow path twisting through the Poudre Canyon wilderness of northern Colorado. The morning light filtered through spruce and pine, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and mountain runoff. Among the hikers was 3-year-old Jared Atadero, darting ahead of the adults with the kind of boundless energy that only a child could keep. His father, Alan, had entrusted the day's outing to a small group from a nearby Christian singles retreat. It was meant to be a harmless walk through the woods. The trail winds beside the Poudre River, climbing gradually into higher country where cliffs rise on both sides and the forest grows thick. To the hikers, it was a peaceful landscape, remote but serene, alive with bird calls and the soft crack of branches underfoot. But that stillness hides a truth familiar to rangers. The Big South Trail is beautiful precisely because it is unforgiving. Distances seem shorter than they are, sound travels unevenly, and visibility drops quickly once a turn or ridge divides the path. When the group reached a bend that overlooked the river, Jared had already disappeared around the corner. Someone called his name, expecting him to appear just ahead, smiling and proud of being the leader. The seconds lengthened into minutes. The hikers spread out, checking along the banks, thinking he might have paused to toss a rock or watch the current. But the boy was nowhere in sight. They shouted until their voices echoed against the stone. Somewhere beyond the next turn, only the roar of the water answered back. By the time Alan was told his son had vanished, hours had already passed. He drove straight to the trailhead and ran up the path, calling into the trees, his voice breaking with every echo. The wilderness felt endless. Shadows stretched across the river as afternoon faded to dusk. And by the time the first search team arrived, night had fallen. Rangers, volunteers and local rescuers fanned out in every direction, their flashlights flickering through the underbrush. The search that followed was one of the largest in Larimer County history. Helicopters hovered low over the valley, their lights sweeping the terrain while ground teams scoured the riverbanks and ridges. Trained dogs traced faint scents that led nowhere in particular. The terrain was brutal, steep inclines, sudden drops, and dense vegetation that swallowed tracks almost instantly. The river's cold current ran fast and deep in places, forcing divers to probe pools and eddies where the water slowed. Each effort ended the same way, with nothing found. For days the search continued. Volunteers described the silence as suffocating, the forest so thick that sound was lost only a few steps away. Every footprint, every scrap of cloth was examined, but no sign of the boy emerged. Some rescuers believed Jared had fallen into the river and been swept downstream, but no body surfaced despite the intensity of the search. Others wondered whether he had wandered upward, drawn by the slope that seemed to lead towards sunlight, but in reality climbed into near vertical terrain. In the aftermath, theories began to grow around what could have happened on that quiet mountain trail. The possibility of a mountain lion attack was raised early. Sightings of cougars were not uncommon in the area. Yet investigators found no blood, no drag marks, and no signs of predation. The canyon walls and the tangle of rock made abduction seem improbable, but it was not dismissed. The mystery deepened because everything about the disappearance contradicted the conditions. There were adults nearby, the trail was well travelled, and the child had vanished in broad daylight. Months passed, and snow came to the canyon. The search dwindled, but the case stayed alive in the hearts of those who'd walked those woods. For Alin Atadero, the trail became a place of both grief and obsession. He returned often, retracing the path with rangers, asking questions, hoping for a clue that might have been overlooked. But the forest remained indifferent, its vastness swallowing every sound as though nothing had ever happened there. In 2003, 4 years after Jared vanished, 2 hikers climbing high above the trail stumbled upon something strange. Near a ridge almost 500 feet above the valley floor, they found a child's shoe resting neatly on the ground. Beside it lay a torn piece of clothing weathered by years of exposure but still recognizable as a child's jacket. Investigators were called in, and after careful examination of the area, more remains were discovered scattered among the rocks. Dental records confirmed what Alin had feared most. The site, however, raised more questions than it answered. The location of the discovery made little sense. The terrain between the trail and that ridge was nearly impassable, a maze of cliffs, loose rock and thick timber. Even seasoned climbers struggled to reach it. Search teams during the original effort had covered much of that area, yet the remains had gone unnoticed. Some speculated that animals had carried the items upward over time, though the intact condition of the shoe argued otherwise. Others wondered if the boy had somehow climbed higher in confusion, though that seemed nearly impossible for a 3-year-old. The final reports were cautious, noting that while mountain lions were present in the region, there was no evidence to support or disprove an attack. The coroner could not determine a definitive cause of death. The story drew national attention not only because of the heartbreak of a young child lost, but also because of the eerie implausibility of where he was found. How Jared reached that height, what path he followed, and why his belongings were arranged so strangely remain unanswered. Over time, the Big South Trail returned to being what it had always been, a quiet stretch of wilderness, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Hikers still pass through, pausing at the points where the river curves sharply under granite cliffs. The wind moves through the trees with a low hum, and the sound of water masks nearly everything else. Few know that somewhere above those ridges a small shoe was once found, its presence defying every line drawn on the map below. A sudden shift in perception strikes some hikers, moments of disorientation twisting familiar paths into the unfamiliar, shadows falling where no tree could cast them, and the faint echo of children's laughter that disappears when pursued. Others describe a subtle shift in temperature, a chill that moves through the body even in sunlight, as if the canyon itself breathes and watches. These fleeting impressions, dismissed by many as imagination or fatigue, linger in the minds of those who walk the Big South Trail, adding a quiet, persistent sense that the wilderness holds more than just rock and river. When the forest is still and the river falls silent for a moment, it feels as though the canyon itself is holding a secret it refuses to give back. Brian Perry at Mount Meeker, Rocky Mountain, NP. High above the tree line, where wind carves the rock bare and the horizon stretches without mercy, Mount Meeker rises beside the more famous Longs Peak like a silent twin. Its ridges are sharp and unwelcoming, its slopes littered with loose granite that shifts beneath each step. Even in summer, the mountain keeps its cold demeanour, the air thin and the weather unpredictable. Those who venture there often speak of its solitude, a place where every sound seems consumed by the immensity of stone. It was into this landscape in October 2018 that 38-year-old Brian Perry began a climb he would never return from. He was not a novice to the mountains. Friends described him as quiet, methodical and capable, someone who approached nature with both respect and confidence. A resident of Pennsylvania, he had spent time hiking in the Rockies before, drawn by their austere beauty and challenge. When he arrived at Rocky Mountain National Park, he told no one of a grand plan or summit attempt. To many, it appeared to be another solo outing, one of countless hikes that begin in the stillness of morning and end with the fading light of day. On the morning he vanished, his car remained neatly parked at the Sand Beach Lake trailhead, its windows misted from the night's chill. The trail leading toward Mount Meeker begins gently, winding through pine and spruce before opening into vast alpine meadows. It is a route that deceives in its calm beginning, for beyond the tree line the slope steepens sharply and the weather shifts without warning. Hikers later recalled seeing a man matching Perry's description that morning, alone, steady-paced, carrying a light pack. None could say exactly where he turned from the main trail or at what point the mountain swallowed him from sight. Rescue teams deployed within hours, scanning ravines and slopes mapped by satellite, tracing the likely routes an experienced hiker might have taken. When Perry failed to return by nightfall, park rangers launched a coordinated search involving ground crews, dogs, and aerial surveillance. The operation extended across more than 20 square miles of terrain, a region known for its treacherous gullies and sudden fog. For days, helicopters circled the peaks, their rotors echoing through the valleys, yet the only response was the mountain's stillness. The mountain offered no easy logic. From the air, its faces looked deceptively simple, but up close, Meeker's cliffs break into mazes of stone, with false ledges that vanish into space. Ridges narrow to knife edges where one misstep means a fatal fall. Even experienced climbers find its routes disorienting, as weather can cloak the summit in cloud within minutes. Searchers reported the sensation of being watched by the mountain itself, a presence that seemed to shift as the light moved across the rock. A camera lens was later recovered from a ledge below the summit, found by a climber several months after the search was suspended. It matched the make and model Perry was known to carry. The lens lay beside fragments of fabric faded by sun and snow, yet there was no trace of the man himself. No bones, no clothing, no equipment that might explain where he had gone. Investigators revisited earlier search maps, noting that the area had been surveyed multiple times by both ground and air. The find suggested he had reached a high point on the mountain, though no sign of descent existed below. Near the lens, searchers noted subtle irregularities in the terrain. Small depressions in the snow formed patterns that seemed almost deliberate, yet no footprints led to or from them. Nearby rocks were displaced in ways that suggested careful handling, as if someone had paused to brace or rest before vanishing. Frost etched across the ledge in unusual swirls, reflecting light differently than the surrounding ice, giving the impression of movement frozen in time. These anomalies were brief and easily overlooked, yet they reinforced a growing sense among climbers and rescuers that Mount Meeker's upper slopes preserved traces of passage, only partially visible to the human eye. Reports conflicted over how far he might have climbed before the weather turned. That week, conditions had shifted rapidly. Warm sun replaced by sudden gusts and freezing sleet. Rangers believed he could have been caught in a fast-moving storm, perhaps seeking shelter along the cliffs. Others speculated that he had fallen into one of the deep crevices that laced the upper ridges, where snow accumulates even in October. These fractures can conceal remains for years, their entrances narrow and easily overlooked. Theories multiplied, but none fit neatly with the known evidence. Those who knew him spoke of his precision and calm, his habit of leaving notes about his plans and always checking weather reports before setting out. It was this reliability that made his disappearance so incomprehensible. Perry's family remained in contact with park officials long after the search ended, pressing for continued patrols and new analyses of satellite imagery. Despite their efforts, no new clues surfaced. The park search logs eventually marked the case as inactive, the last entry noting no further leads, subject unlocated. By autumn, the mountain had reclaimed its stillness. Snow swept over the slopes where searchers had once called his name, erasing their footprints and flags. The wind that cut across the ridge sounded like a low hum against the rock, the only movement in a landscape emptied of human presence. From the valleys below, Mount Meeker appeared unchanged, another peak in a range that has taken more lives than it has returned. Each year, hikers pass beneath it unaware that somewhere above them lies a mystery preserved in ice and stone. For investigators, the case remains a study in contradiction. A hiker with experience, clear weather at the start, a well-travelled trail, and yet an outcome with no evidence, no recovery, and no witnesses. In most disappearances, time yields at least fragments, a shoe, a torn strap, a phone or a wallet. Here, even those traces are uncertain. Some rescuers believe he may have fallen where no one will ever find him. Others think the evidence that surfaced was only a fraction of what the mountain still hides. As seasons continue to pass, Mount Meeker keeps its indifferent watch. Its slopes shift subtly with each freeze and thaw, carrying stones downhill as if slowly erasing the paths once taken. The hikers who stand on its lower ridges today often describe an inexplicable unease, a quiet that deepens beyond natural silence. They speak of feeling small beneath its cliffs, aware of the space between presence and absence that lingers in the thin air. It has been recorded that climbers occasionally notice subtle anomalies that defy explanation. A faint imprint in snow that does not match boots, the echo of a voice carried too clearly across the wind, or a shadow glimpsed on a ridge that disappears when approached. Some say the air itself seems heavier in certain spots, pressing against the chest in the way only high altitude can, yet accompanied by a strange sense of being watched. These fleeting impressions, though dismissed by many as imagination or fatigue, accumulate into a quiet narrative of presence, an unspoken awareness that the mountain holds secrets it will not reveal. And somewhere within that vast cathedral of stone, the trail simply ends. Keith Reinhard and Tom Young in Silver Plume, Colorado. Tucked between the mountains of Clear Creek County lies Silver Plume, a place so small that a stranger's arrival rarely goes unnoticed. Its weathered buildings lean against the slopes like aging sentinels, relics of a mining age long gone. In the hush between the passing of freight trains and the sigh of wind through pine, the town carries a peculiar stillness, as if sound itself hesitates before crossing its narrow streets. Life in Silver Plume moved slowly, and its people grew accustomed to the quiet rhythm of isolation. A handful of residents tended to their small shops, watched the seasons turn, and gathered in the cafe or the bar to exchange the same familiar stories. It was a town where memory outlasted progress, where every door seemed to open into another version of the past. Among its few residents was Tom Young, a quiet man who kept to himself but was well liked by those who knew him. He managed a small bookstore, his days marked by the soft rustle of pages and the regular visits of locals stopping to chat. He lived with his dog, Gus, and though few knew much about his private life, there was a calm reliability about him that fit the slow pulse of the town. When Tom disappeared in September 1987, the quiet of Silver Plume turned uneasy. His store remained locked, and his truck sat untouched. At first, there was little alarm. People thought he had gone hiking or taken a short trip. But as days turned to weeks, concern deepened. Then came the discovery, nearly a year later. Tom's remains, found high in the mountains with his dog beside him, a revolver nearby. The authorities called it suicide. Yet even with the case closed, a heavy silence lingered as though the mountains had whispered back something no one could quite hear. Nearly a year later, another man arrived, Keith Reinhard, a tall, soft-spoken journalist from Illinois. He was 49 and restless, searching for change, perhaps for meaning. Silver Plume, with its quiet streets and dramatic backdrop, seemed like a place where one could start over. He rented a small storefront once used by Tom Young, determined to open an antique shop. The coincidence was not lost on the locals, though few imagined how deep it would soon run. He rented an old storefront with uneven floors and a faded window that caught the afternoon light. By day, he sold trinkets and curiosities. By night, he wrote, his typewriter echoing faintly through the stillness. He was working on a novel, a story about a man who walks into the mountains and never returns. Friends found the subject curious, though Keith brushed off their concern with a smile. He said the story was inspired by Tom Young. As weeks passed, Keith's fascination with Tom's disappearance grew. He spoke often of it, of coincidences, of the mystery, of the need to understand what drives a man to vanish into the wild. Some said he became obsessed. He told friends he wanted to hike the same trails, to see the same views Tom might have seen. One afternoon he said something that chilled those who remembered it later. "If I don't come back, call the authorities." Locals began to notice the change. His once friendly manner turned distant. He spent long hours staring at maps, tracing routes through the high country. A few residents, remembering what had happened to Tom, urged him not to go alone. He thanked them, but seemed determined. That August day in 1988, he left town without much ceremony. Just his camera, a small pack, and a strange, unreadable calm. The day he vanished began without incident. The sun hung high over the peaks, and a few tourists passed through town, unaware of what was unfolding in its shadow. Sometime after noon, Keith walked into the mountains, following a trail that led toward Pendleton Mountain, a place rugged and steep where storms can gather without warning. He was last seen about halfway up, pausing it seemed to look back down towards Silver Plume before disappearing into the trees. Search teams combed the slopes for a week. Helicopters circled, rescuers shouted his name, and volunteers scoured creeks and ravines. Not a trace was found. No gear, no clothing, no camera, nothing. The weather turned, snow came early, and the mountain swallowed its silence once more. When no trace emerged, the case began to drift into the realm of speculation. Some said he fell, others that he intended never to return. Yet those who knew him doubted that theory. Keith had plans, a family waiting back home, and no sign of despair. To them, his disappearance felt too deliberate, too eerie in its mirroring of Tom Young's fate. What unsettled residents most was the symmetry of it all. Two men, drawn to the same small town. Two stories ending in the same wilderness, even the same rented space, as if something unseen lingered in those walls. The locals began to whisper about Silver Plume's curse, a phrase spoken half in jest, half in unease. Reporters came and went, and the town retreated further into itself, unwilling to explain what could not be explained. From that period, some residents still speak of subtle, inexplicable signs. Windows in Keith's shop sometimes rattled without wind, and at night faint footsteps echoed across the uneven floors as though someone moved among the shelves. Lights flickered inexplicably, and sometimes the smell of pine or smoke would drift in from nowhere, as if the mountains themselves had intruded into the small storefront. Locals whispered that the building seemed to remember Tom Young, and now, perhaps, Keith Reinhard too. At present, Silver Plume endures much as it did before, quiet, weathered and watchful. The mountains still tower above it, their slopes dark with pine and shadow. The old storefront remains, though few speak of its history. Visitors sometimes stop, asking about the disappearances, but the answers, when offered, come soft and brief, as though the words themselves might stir something best left undisturbed. Those traversing the ridges recall that hikers and hunters in the surrounding ridges report brief glimpses of movement where no one should be. Shadows flit between trees, distant figures pause on outcroppings, and voices sometimes carry over the wind, soft, urgent, and quickly swallowed by the forest. Those familiar with the stories sense a symmetry in these fleeting apparitions, a quiet echo of the vanished, reminding the town that Silver Plume's mountains do not easily release what they claim. And in the still hours between dusk and dawn, when the wind moves down from the high peaks, some swear they see a lone figure on the ridges above town. A man paused mid-step, looking back towards Silver Plume before fading again into the mountain silence. Michelle Vanek on Mount of the Holy Cross. The slopes of Mount of the Holy Cross rise with quiet indifference, their ridges carved by centuries of wind and ice. At certain angles, the mountain's snowy gullies form a cross-shaped scar visible from miles away, a natural emblem that has long drawn pilgrims and climbers alike. It was here, amid Colorado's rugged wilderness, that 35-year-old Michelle Vanek vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of confusion and sorrow that would haunt rescuers for years to come. By the time the sun climbed over the peaks on September 24, 2005, Michelle had already begun her ascent with her hiking partner, Louis Nunez. The pair set out to reach the 14,000 5-foot summit, a demanding climb even for seasoned hikers. Reports later described the morning as calm and clear, the kind of deceptive tranquility that often precedes the mountain's sudden shifts in weather. Michelle, a mother of 4 and an avid runner, was physically fit, but she was new to high-altitude hiking. Her goal was simple yet symbolic: to stand upon the famed Mountain of the Cross and take in its austere beauty. Not long after the ascent began, fatigue began to take its toll. As the trail steepened and oxygen thinned, Michelle's pace slowed. Nunez pressed ahead to scout the route toward the summit, telling her to rest and promising to return shortly. When he retraced his steps, she was gone. What followed was a desperate search that would consume weeks, drawing in dozens of rescuers and volunteers who combed the mountain's ridges, drainages and scree fields in hope of finding any sign of her passage. Throughout the operation, the landscape itself seemed to resist the searchers' efforts. The Holy Cross wilderness is a maze of gullies and talus slopes, each one capable of swallowing footprints and sound alike. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning for clothing or movement among the broken stones. Dogs were deployed but struggled in the thin air, their senses dulled by altitude and shifting winds. Every possible route she might have taken was retraced, yet the mountain yielded nothing: no clothing, no belongings, no scent. Among the rescuers, unease began to spread. It was as if Michelle had simply dissolved into the terrain. Some wondered whether she'd wandered off trail, seeking a shortcut toward Nunez's last known location, only to descend into one of the countless drainages that funnel into the forest below. Others speculated that she might have fallen into one of the deep concealed crevices that scar the mountain's flanks. Yet, despite repeated air and ground searches, even the most obvious hazards produced no results. The mountain remained silent, its snowfields erasing all trace of her passage. On returning, some hikers and guides who later traversed the same slopes reported subtle anomalies. Rocks shifted in patterns that suggested recent movement, though no footprints or snow impressions accompanied them. Faint, irregular sounds, like distant footsteps or whispered voices, echoed through gullies where no one stood. Even seasoned climbers spoke of an uneasy sense of being observed, a sensation that intensified near hidden drainages and snow-laden crevices. These fleeting experiences, though unverified, added to the perception that certain areas of the Holy Cross wilderness possess a presence that subtly disrupts perception and erases the passage of those who venture too far alone. Fleeting figures occasionally appeared on the ridge, seeming to mimic human movement yet dissolving when approached. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and snow patterns occasionally hinted at steps that could not exist. At times, a faint scent of smoke or pine lingered where no fire had burned, and small depressions appeared in soft snow, vanishing hours later under sun or wind. These ephemeral traces left searchers unsettled, suggesting that the mountain did not merely obscure evidence, it subtly rearranged the familiar, leaving only fragments of passage in its wake. As days stretched into weeks, the operation transformed from a rescue into a recovery. The search grew to involve one of the largest efforts in Colorado history, with over 700 volunteers covering nearly every possible route she could have taken. The US Forest Service closed entire sections of the wilderness to accommodate the search teams, whose base camp became a hub of radio chatter and hope steadily eroding under the weight of exhaustion. Still, not a single piece of evidence emerged. Not a shoe print, not a fragment of gear, not even a scrap of fabric caught on the branch. The absence of clues gave rise to whispers that unsettled even the most rational minds. Some locals pointed to the mountain's long history of misfortune, recalling earlier accounts of climbers who had vanished or fallen in the same unforgiving terrain. Others recalled the legends surrounding the mountain itself. Named after its distinctive snow formation, that once drew devout pilgrims seeking divine signs. In old mountaineering lore, the cross of snow was seen not as a beacon of faith, but as a warning, an emblem of sacrifice and loss. To those familiar with its slopes, the idea that the mountain had claimed yet another life seemed almost inevitable. In the weeks that followed, the physical toll on searchers was evident. Hypothermia, altitude sickness, and exhaustion became constant threats. Teams rotated daily, methodically sweeping zones that had already been cleared, convinced they must have missed something. But the Holy Cross Wilderness has a way of distorting perception. Distances seem shorter than they are, and ravines hide their depth until it's too late. Some rescuers later admitted they felt watched, describing an oppressive stillness that descended as they combed the upper slopes, as though the mountain itself resented intrusion. Months later, when winter reclaimed the peaks, the search was officially suspended. Michelle's family continued to visit the area, holding out hope that spring thaw might reveal something, a clue, a trace, an answer. Yet even after the snows melted and the streams ran high again, nothing surfaced. Her disappearance joined a growing list of cases in Colorado's high country, where climbers had seemingly been erased from existence. Years passed, and the mountain remained unchanged. Season after season, hikers ascended its slopes, some aware of the story, others oblivious to the unresolved tragedy beneath their feet. Memorial crosses and tokens left by strangers appeared near the trailhead, weathered by sun and rain. Each one marked a silent acknowledgement that somewhere in those ridges a mystery endures, a question suspended between the physical and the unseen. Among the unanswered details, perhaps the most haunting is the utter lack of closure. Without remains, without evidence, every theory remained speculation. Did she slip and fall into an unseen ravine, her body carried far beyond the search area? Did disorientation lead her downward, where exhaustion and exposure overtook her before she could signal for help? Or did the mountain, in its vast and ancient indifference, simply keep her, as it has others before her? In the fading hush above the timberline, the mountain holds what it will not return. Missing 14 ERs and lost against altitude. Across Colorado's highest peaks, the air itself feels thinner than truth. These summits, rising above 14,000 feet, appear crystalline from a distance, bright, immaculate, and inviting. Yet those who climb them know how easily the light deceives. The atmosphere up here is different, almost brittle, where every breath burns and every thought seems stretched across the empty blue. At these altitudes, even a clear morning can hide its intent. Each year, names are added quietly to a growing list of those who never came back down. They are not gathered under one incident or storm, but scattered across maps like faint signatures fading in snow. Volunteers, climbers, and seasoned hikers have vanished on peaks such as Mount Evans, Blanca, Crestone Needle, and Long's Peak. Some are beginners misjudging their limits, others are experts who know every ridge by heart. Their disappearances span decades, yet the pattern remains unsettlingly similar. People ascending into sunlight and not returning before dusk. Among climbers, there's talk of the 14er effect, a mixture of ambition, exhaustion, and fate. The phrase began as a caution, whispered at trailheads and rescue camps, but over time it became folklore. Altitude sickness clouds judgment, dehydration dulls movement, and exposure steals strength faster than reason can respond. Yet within that mix of danger, something intangible lingers. Stories circulate of those who felt watched on open slopes, who heard muffled footsteps pacing behind them, only to find no trace when they turned. Weather on these summits changes faster than thought, swallowing trails beneath sudden whiteouts. In minutes, visibility can drop from clear horizon to a blind swirl of ice. Compasses malfunction, GPS units lose signal, and familiar routes vanish beneath a shifting skin of snow. Rescue teams often recount the same phrase: "It's like the mountain erased them." There are cases where hikers radioed their positions moments before being engulfed in fog, and when the storm cleared, no footprints remained. In that airless stillness, sound vanishes first. Even shouts dissolve before they reach another ear. Climbers describe hearing their own voices bounce strangely against the wind, as if absorbed mid-echo. The isolation grows not only around, but inside them. Thoughts stretch thin and time seems to slow. It becomes easy to step away from a group without realizing how far one has gone. In the space of a few breaths, Visibility narrows to a few feet, and orientation slips into confusion. Some search parties found gear arranged too neatly, as if placed there with deliberate care. Backpacks zipped, boots aligned, even trekking poles propped upright in snow. These small details disturb rescuers more than signs of struggle. It suggests that the lost were calm, methodical, perhaps too calm for those facing fatal conditions. To some, it implies exhaustion beyond panic. To others, it hints at a state of mind altered by the altitude itself. Others discovered tracks that ended mid-slope without slide marks or collapse. A straight line of footprints simply ceases, leading neither upward nor down. The terrain offers no crevice, no cornice, no hidden drop. It is as though the person kept walking into the air. These abrupt terminations appear in search reports often enough to become their own category, unexplained track endings. Rescuers learn to stop questioning them after a while, acknowledging that not everything left behind at 14,000 feet can be understood. Sudden changes in sound and light sometimes catch climbers off guard, defying any logical explanation. A faint echo might return words not spoken, or sunlight glinting off distant rock seems to change angle as they move. Some swear they see footprints in the snow that lead toward a cliff, only to vanish when approached. Others feel a subtle pull, a direction their body wants to follow even against conscious thought. These anomalies, fleeting and inconsistent, reinforce the sense that the 14 ERs are not merely physical challenges. They are spaces where perception itself becomes unreliable, and the boundary between reality and illusion grows perilously thin. The higher the elevation, the more unpredictable the human mind becomes. Lack of oxygen narrows thought to a flickering thread, and fatigue distorts direction. Climbers have reported walking downhill, believing they were ascending, or turning circles while certain they were moving straight ahead. In these moments, the body follows hallucination, and logic yields to instinct. Once separated from the group, a person can vanish in minutes, descending into a labyrinth of snow gullies and scree that even helicopters can't fully map. Some mountaineers have noted strange physical sensations preceding disappearance. A sudden numbness that cannot be explained by cold, a fleeting vertigo where the slope seems to tilt in impossible angles, or the sense that the wind carries whispers from nowhere. Some describe seeing fleeting figures on adjacent ridges that vanish when approached, or shadows that stretch in ways inconsistent with the sun's position. These experiences, brief yet vivid, are often dismissed as altitude-induced hallucinations, but their consistency across decades and locations suggests something more pervasive, an unseen force that subtly manipulates perception high above the tree line. Veteran rescuers speak of hallucinations in the thin air, phantom lights, echoing voices, shifting shadows that move just beyond peripheral vision. One team on Blanca Peak reported hearing steady whistling somewhere above them, faint but constant, fading each time they tried to locate its source. Others described sudden warmth where the air should freeze, a fleeting sense of presence that disappears when they look around. None of these accounts appear in official logs, yet they circulate among crews as unspoken truths. Even in summer, temperatures near the summits drop below freezing within minutes. Storms materialize out of clear skies, hailstones forming without warning, and lightning splitting the air so thin it feels alive. Rescuers have learned that timing means nothing. Safety exists only for those who turn back early. The missing rarely do. They push toward the final ridge, lured by the illusion that the peak lies just ahead, when in reality, the last few hundred feet become the most lethal. No single explanation fits the pattern. Each case fractures into its own silence. Experts cite exhaustion, sudden weather, or cognitive failure, but none of these explain why so many disappear under identical conditions, often within sight of safety. These losses accumulate like snowdrifts, quiet, unremarked, until counted. The mountains give back some, but never all. Those who return often recall nothing beyond the moment before disorientation struck, as if memory itself had been stripped away. To those who climb after them, every cairn and ridge feels like a threshold to something unseen. There is reverence among hikers who pause at memorial plaques, whose names mark places of ascent turned grave. At sunrise, the peaks gleam with deceptive peace, their beauty undisturbed by what lies beneath. It is this contradiction that draws people back, the purity of danger, the perfection of risk. To stand at such heights is to test the edge between wonder and oblivion, knowing both can look the same from above. Above 14,000 feet, even memory thins, and the mountains keep what the air forgets. Mountain cabin abductions and campground mysteries. In the mountain towns that border the forests, cabins are meant to feel safe. Wood, warmth, and distance from noise. Their lights glow softly at night, lanterns of comfort in a landscape otherwise ruled by cold and silence. Families come seeking quiet weekends and rest, drawn by the promise of still lakes and distant peaks. The wilderness seems tamed here, pushed back just enough to allow coffee on the porch and laughter by the fire. But comfort, in these high places, has always been fragile. Yet across Colorado's high country campgrounds and rental cabins, police files hold a pattern that defies logic. Reports stretch back decades, vacationers gone without trace, vehicles still parked outside, doors left unbroken. The frequency is low enough to avoid national attention, yet steady enough that locals whisper about it with unease. Each case reads the same: peaceful arrival, sudden absence, no clear trail out. For investigators, it is not the violence of the losses that lingers, but their silence. One of the earliest cases emerged near Twin Lakes, where a family of 4 was last seen unpacking supplies beside their rented lodge. The father, a machinist from Denver, had rented the cabin for a weekend of fishing and hiking. Neighbors recalled seeing smoke from their chimney late that evening and hearing children laughing through the trees. When the sun rose the next morning, the laughter had gone. No one saw them leave, and no tire tracks led away from the property. The next morning, neighbors found the cabin unlocked, breakfast set on the table, and the family gone. Pancakes browned on the stove, milk had soured in open cups. A radio murmured static from the counter, and the family's shoes rested by the door. Investigators scoured the shoreline, expecting perhaps a boating accident or wrong turn, but the water yielded nothing. Search dogs circled the cabin repeatedly, then lay down, refusing to move farther into the trees. Years later and miles north, another group disappeared from a remote campground along the Cache La Poudre River. It was autumn, the aspens gold, the air thin and sharp. 2 friends, both experienced hikers, were due back in Fort Collins after a weekend retreat. Their campsite was found 3 days later, orderly and untouched. Firewood stacked, food sealed, tent zipped. It looked like a scene paused mid-living, waiting for its occupants to return. Investigators arrived to find tents collapsed but untouched, a campfire still smouldering, and no footprints leading away. Tracks were visible up to the fire ring, then abruptly stopped, as though erased. Even the forest floor beneath the tents appeared undisturbed, pine needles lying flat, uncrushed. Equipment and clothing remained. Wallets and car keys rested on a nearby rock. Helicopters searched the surrounding slopes for a week, but no trace emerged. Not clothing, not scent, not a single clue to suggest directional struggle. Some searchers blamed animal attacks, yet the absence of blood or drag marks told another story. Bears, cougars, and coyotes leave evidence, but this was absence disguised as order. It was as though the land had reclaimed what entered, sealing over any trace. A veteran tracker described it quietly to a reporter. They didn't leave, they were removed. The phrase never appeared in print, but among rescuers it was repeated in low voices during later searches. Locals began speaking of the silent hours, that moment between dusk and full dark when voices seemed to fade quicker than light. Hunters who stayed in the woods after sundown reported feeling watched from just beyond lantern range. Some claimed that sound behaved differently in these valleys. Words thrown into the open would not echo back. Others heard faint tapping from the trees or found rocks stacked deliberately near their camps come morning. These tales drifted between folklore and fear, never quite dismissed, never entirely believed. Reports multiplied through the 1980s and 1990s, always sharing the same unnerving calm before discovery. A young couple near Gunnison. 2 students are camping near Pike National Forest. Father and son outside Leadville. All vanished between sunset and morning, leaving camps too neat to make sense. Rangers began to note how identical the aftermaths appeared. Fires burned out naturally, belongings undisturbed, no sign of flight or pursuit. Each scene looked prepared, as though carefully staged to appear ordinary. Signs appear at intervals on the path, suggesting intention, yet they reveal nothing to those who pass. A trail marker knocked slightly askew, a pile of stones forming a small arrow, or footprints that appear to lead toward a clearing and then vanish entirely. Some campers describe waking to find personal items moved subtly, a hat on a bench, a backpack rotated, or a chair shifted a few inches, though no one admits entering the site. These minor disturbances, while easily dismissed as wind or wildlife, recur in patterns too consistent to ignore, suggesting that something unseen interacts with the environment in ways that mimic human presence, erasing itself before discovery. Cabins found unlocked, doors open to the cold, food still warm, as though time itself stepped away for a moment. Some were discovered hours after a radio check-in, others after weeks of silence. Even when authorities secured these sites, a strange heaviness remained, described by officers as like a room waiting for someone to return. It was the absence of noise that unsettled most. The wind seemed to hush near these places, trees standing still even when storms moved through nearby valleys. Rangers describe unease during those searches, claiming the woods felt charged, as if something nearby listened but never moved. Radios crackled with static that ceased the instant crews crossed certain clearings. Flashlights dimmed inexplicably, then returned to full strength once back on the main trail. One ranger later admitted he refused to camp overnight near those sites again, saying the air felt aware. Others dismissed it as exhaustion, yet even skeptics left those searches shaken. In several of these disappearances, radio signals weakened inexplicably within tight forest pockets. Teams lost contact within a few hundred feet, though topography offered no reason for interference. Batteries drained faster than expected, GPS markers froze mid-refresh, and maps seemed less reliable under the canopy. The forest appeared to rearrange itself between patrols, fallen trees shifting, landmarks subtly altered. When crews retraced their steps the next morning, the terrain never looked quite the same. The more investigators searched, the smaller the world around them felt, trees closing in, air thickening with quiet. By the third or fourth day of any search, the focus turned inward, fatigue blurred judgment, and the landscape's scale began to feel endless. Yet every lost campsite suggested the same question. How could multiple people vanish without evidence of flight, without even the sound of retreat? The answer, if there was one, seemed to dissolve into the very stillness that haunted those woods. To this day, none of these cabins or campgrounds bear official warnings. They remain open, booked by travelers seeking solitude. Families still light fires in the same hearths, pitch tents in the same clearings, laugh under the same stars. Only a few locals mention what happened before, usually after dark when the wind begins to move through the trees again. What remains most unsettling is that nothing about the wilderness has changed. It simply waits, as it always has. And when night settles over those empty cabins, even the wind seems careful not to disturb what once answered back. Vanishing fire, lookouts and watchtowers. Along ridgelines where lightning strikes more often than footsteps, wooden towers once stood as silent guardians above the endless forests of the Rockies. They were built for vigilance, perched high enough that their keepers could see smoke curl miles away, where valleys folded into mist. In their isolation, these lookouts lived alone with the wind, their cabins trembling through storms and their eyes trained on horizons that never seemed to move. To them, the mountains were both home and cage, a landscape that revealed beauty and menace in equal measure. Decades ago, before satellites and drones, human eyes guarded the forests. Dozens of watchtowers dotted the higher elevations of Colorado, each manned by a solitary figure charged with spotting the faintest wisp of fire. They lived for weeks, sometimes months, cut off from the world below, relying only on ration drops and radio transmissions that echoed faintly through the static. For many, it was a test of endurance, of mental balance against a silence so deep it could fracture thought. But as the years passed, some of these lookouts began to vanish, leaving behind towers as empty as the echoes they once contained. One of the most unsettling accounts came from the slopes near Twin Sisters Peak, where a fire lookout named John Sullivan was stationed during the summer of 1948. Sullivan had reported unusual lights moving across the tree line late at night, claiming they flickered in patterns that didn't match any human signal. Then, one morning, he stopped responding entirely. Searchers climbed the steep trail to the tower and found everything inside untouched. His food lay out, coffee half poured, and the logbook was open to a page describing 3 flashes to the west. No footprints were found beyond the platform, and no trace of him was ever recovered. When rescuers reached the tower, the door was bolted from the inside. To enter, they had to force it open, splintering the frame. His gear was there, his binoculars neatly aligned with the window. Even the chair he'd sat in faced the same direction, toward a horizon shrouded in low clouds. Investigators assumed he had fallen, though there was no sign of disturbance below. Some of the men refused to sleep in the tower afterward, saying that when night fell, they heard the boards creak as if someone were pacing in circles above them. Elsewhere, miles away across another range, the same pattern emerged. At a watchtower in the San Juan Mountains, a young woman named Margaret Rice disappeared during her final week of service in 1965. Her logbook contained increasingly disjointed entries, references to distant voices and a face in the glass. Rangers searching for her found her jacket neatly folded on the steps, her flashlight still glowing faintly beside it. The trail leading down from the tower was covered in fresh snow, yet bore no footprints at all. Psychologists later suggested that solitude breeds distortion. The mind, deprived of human contact and constant motion, begins to interpret silence as sound and shadow as movement. It was an easy explanation for disappearances that defied logic, a way to rationalize what the forests refused to give back. But those who'd served in the towers disagreed. They described moments when the woods below would grow so still that the birds stopped calling, when a sudden pressure seemed to fill the air, as if something unseen had begun listening. The mountain itself seemed to erase its witnesses with quiet precision. In remote corners of the Rockies, towers once mapped in official records vanished entirely, reclaimed by snow and decay. The coordinates still exist on maps, but when modern hikers reach the spots, they find only disturbed soil, a few rusted bolts, and sometimes the remnants of old glass lenses buried in moss. Forest Service archives list them as decommissioned, yet no paperwork explains when or how they were dismantled. From distant valleys, faint signals were sometimes heard through static. Radio operators during the 1970s documented strange intermittent transmissions on emergency frequencies, short bursts of sound followed by fragments of human speech. The recordings were unintelligible, though some claimed to hear names repeated over and over, often those of lookouts long presumed dead. The signals would appear only during electrical storms, as if carried on the same currents that once drew firewatchers to their posts. From specific vantage points, some hikers report encountering inexplicable traces near these towers, footprints leading toward the structure that vanish at the threshold, faint impressions in moss that appear freshly pressed yet bear no human scent, and fleeting reflections in broken glass that resemble figures moving where no one stands. In several instances, animals near the towers behave unusually. Birds avoid the area entirely. Small mammals skitter away as though aware of an unseen presence, and even wind patterns carry an unnatural stillness, as if the ridge itself resists disturbance. These subtle phenomena reinforce the sense that the mountains remember the vanished, holding the echoes of watchers who no longer exist in forms that human eyes can verify. Some former firewatchers recount unusual interactions with the towers long after they were abandoned. Compass needles spin erratically near the structures, and altimeters sometimes register sudden drops even on level ground. On rare nights, hikers report seeing flickering lights inside empty cabins, moving in patterns that suggest human activity, only for the glow to vanish when approached. Even wildlife avoids these perches. Deer skirt the ridges and birds circle elsewhere, leaving the towers unnaturally silent. These persistent anomalies hint that the mountains retain a memory of those who vanished, a residual presence that lingers where the living once kept watch. In certain regions, the towers still cling to their peaks like skeletal sentinels. They stand weathered and tilting, their steps softened by rot, their windows clouded with frost. Hikers who stumble upon them describe the interiors as unnervingly preserved. Tools hung in place, bunks still made, and notebooks whose final pages crumble at the touch. In one such tower near the Arkansas River Valley, the last entry reads simply, "I hear tapping below the floor." No date follows it. And in the oldest logbooks, a few final entries remain unfinished. Some end mid-sentence, others trail off into indecipherable scribbles. When archivists attempt to trace the handwriting, they find no match among recorded names. It's as though the mountain itself continued writing after the person had gone, recording its own version of events in the language of wind and decay. Those who have read these pages speak of an oppressive stillness, of a sensation that something stands just behind them as they turn each line. What once symbolized human watchfulness now embodies its opposite, the failure to see what waits in the dark corners of the wilderness. Each vanished lookout, each missing watchtower has become a marker in a larger pattern of disappearance that even the forest rangers no longer discuss openly. At night, when fog covers the ridges and the sky glows faintly with lightning, the outlines of those towers seem to reappear for a moment, visible only to those who know where to look. Through the restless play of stormlight and shadow, the mountains seem alive, quietly observing. Phantom signals from mountain peaks. It begins not with sight, but with sound, a thin frequency cutting through the silence. The tone wavers, hesitates, then steadies into rhythm, like breath pressed through a machine. No one knows who first heard it, or whether it came from the ground or the sky, but those who've listened long enough describe the same strange pattern, a voice distorted by static, pausing between bursts as though waiting for an answer. In the high wilderness of Colorado's mountains, where radios often fail and signals vanish into the cliffs, transmissions like these are never supposed to exist. Yet for nearly a century, they have returned at irregular intervals, whispering across the spectrum like something alive. Operators who caught the first recordings described the voices as mechanical but pleading. They would cut through established emergency frequencies, interrupting standard communication with a warped tone that sounded almost human. Some compared it to a distress call trapped in endless repetition, others to a code that refused translation. When the signal first reached Denver's emergency channel in the late 1930s, technicians assumed it originated from a lost pilot. But when they checked the frequency logs, they found nothing. No aircraft, no beacon, and no record of a distress call sent at that time. The earliest report linked to the Rockies dates back to a Forest Service relay in 1939. A ranger named Joseph Green, stationed near Long's Peak, logged a strange intrusion on his shortwave radio, a faint looping message that seemed to say help, followed by a sequence of clicks. The tone never altered, not even when the weather shifted or the batteries drained. For 4 consecutive nights, the same sound returned at precisely the same hour, then stopped completely. When Green's superiors checked the records, they found no rescue operations, no missing personnel, and no nearby transmitters capable of producing the signal. His account was filed, ignored, and forgotten, until years later when the same pattern reappeared hundreds of miles away. The transmission lasted 22 seconds, repeating a phrase that no one could quite decipher. The recording, now archived in a small museum in Estes Park, is almost inaudible beneath the hiss of interference. Listeners who isolate the sound report hearing fragments of speech, sometimes English, sometimes something else entirely. Acoustic specialists who examined the frequency noted that its pitch matched no known human voice, and its spacing suggested that it wasn't random noise. When slowed down, the sound resembled a series of modulated pulses, almost like Morse code spoken aloud. In the following decades, the same signal returned across unrelated frequencies. Amateur radio enthusiasts monitoring mountain storms picked it up during power surges, while hikers with handheld transceivers reported it echoing faintly through static near high passes. It always lasted less than a minute, always began with the same sequence of tones, and always ended abruptly, without fade or distortion. Reports came from Pikes Peak, Mount Elbert, and even the isolated slopes of Blanca Peak, each separated by vast distances yet united by the same inexplicable frequency. Engineers tried triangulating its source, but every reading pointed to the high peaks where no transmitters existed. Teams carried portable scanners into the wilderness, expecting to find illegal repeaters or weather monitoring devices, but found nothing. The signals appeared only during storms or extreme temperature shifts, often coinciding with cloud-to-ground lightning. A few technicians speculated that the pattern might result from electromagnetic anomalies caused by the terrain itself, yet no natural formation should have produced consistent, repeated modulation. Skeptics attributed it to atmospheric reflection, though the tone always carried an unmistakable cadence. They argued that radio waves can bounce between layers of ionized air, distorting transmissions from hundreds of miles away. It was a comfortable explanation, except for one detail. The phrase within the signal, the same impossible sequence, was never traced to any real message. When samples were analysed against global radio archives, none matched. The words didn't belong to any known distress code, and the format predated the technology that could have created it. Others proposed that buried mineral veins might trap and re-emit old transmissions, like geological memories. The theory held that the metal-rich rock of the Rockies could absorb electromagnetic energy, later releasing fragments of it during storms. Some even suggested that ancient military broadcasts had been fossilised within the mountain strata, resurfacing decades later as ghost signals. But those who studied the phenomenon in depth noticed irregularities. Each appearance was slightly different, as though the signal were evolving. The pauses shifted, the tone deepened, and faint undercurrents emerged beneath the static, like a second voice trying to speak through the first. When digital technology replaced analog radios, the voices didn't vanish, they adapted. Reports began to appear from search and rescue teams using encrypted communication systems. In 2006, a dispatcher in Boulder County received a brief, distorted signal that tripped the emergency locator beacon channel. The coordinates transmitted pointed to a point deep within Rocky Mountain National Park, an area long closed due to rock slides. When a team was sent to investigate, they found nothing but collapsed granite and the remnants of an old ranger cabin, abandoned since 1952, its roof still fitted with the skeletal remains of a rusted antenna. Hikers now claim their GPS units and emergency beacons flicker to life near certain summits, broadcasting fragments of language. They describe bursts of data that appear in the same rhythm as the old analog tone, even when their devices are powered off. Some have recorded it, their digital logs showing transmissions with no registered source. A few have reported hearing faint voices through their headsets, calling their own names through the interference. Those recordings, when played back later, contain nothing but a steady hum. Audio analysts examining these recordings note recurring intervals consistent with deliberate transmission. The frequency sits within a narrow range used neither by modern communication systems nor civilian radio. It's as if the signal intentionally occupies a forgotten channel, one that still exists but has long been left empty. One researcher from the University of Colorado found a correlation between those signals and the timing of geomagnetic storms, yet even he admitted the modulation patterns seemed too structured to be natural. Between interference and intention, a voice still rises from the mountains, one that no one has ever managed to trace. The sound flickers across the spectrum at irregular intervals, sometimes silent for years, returning for a single breath before fading again. Those who have heard it say it lingers long after the radio is switched off, an afterimage of sound that seems to echo from inside the mind rather than through the air. When the night turns cold and the peaks vanish into cloud, some swear the static begins to pulse again, as if the mountains are still waiting for someone to answer. Snow cave enigmas in alpine ranges. Beneath the glittering silence of alpine slopes, where winter never fully retreats, lie pockets of ice and hollow snow. Tunnels formed by wind, melt, and time. These natural vaults can stretch deep into the mountainside, some large enough to swallow a person whole, their entrances disguised by drifting snow and shadow. In such places, a single misstep can mean vanishing into a frozen maze where daylight never reaches. But even among the hazards that define high-altitude wilderness, some disappearances connected to snow caves have resisted explanation, leaving behind more questions than the mountains ever seem willing to answer. Occasionally, search parties stumble upon these concealed chambers purely by chance, following a faint depression in the snow or a glint of collapsed ice. Inside, they find spaces strangely preserved, empty gear, undisturbed boots, or fragments of clothing frozen in place, arranged as if untouched since the moment of loss. No tracks are leading in, none are coming out, and no signs of struggle or animal intrusion. The footprints, when visible at all, tend to stop abruptly at the mouth of an opening that looks too small for a person to enter. What lies beyond is darkness dense enough to feel, swallowing even the echo of voices as rescuers call into the void. Archived mountaineering logs describe similar findings dating back decades, scattered across ranges from the Cascades to the Rockies. In 1968, 2 climbers vanished on Washington's Mount Rainier during an early thaw. A month later, their campsite was found intact, but the nearby snowfields contained several perfectly circular holes leading into caverns no one could safely explore. In Colorado, reports from the 1980s mentioned skiers who disappeared after a minor avalanche, only for search teams to later locate neatly stacked packs beneath thin crusts of ice, gear that seemed deliberately placed rather than swept away. The stories are too few to form a pattern, yet too alike to dismiss. On rare late-season trails, hikers have heard the unnerving hollow of shifting snow beneath them, the sound of something vast and empty, waiting. Some describe a faint vibration rising through their boots, a tremor that stops the instant they pause to listen. A few have claimed to hear their own voices echo back from beneath the ground, distorted and delayed. Rangers who followed these accounts rarely find any openings nearby, only solid ice where the sound seemed to originate. Whether these experiences come from acoustic illusions or something beneath the surface remains uncertain, yet the testimonies continue to accumulate, each separated by years but eerily alike in tone. Search teams that investigate these cavities often describe an atmosphere that feels disorienting, as though sound and time behave differently inside. Radio contact becomes erratic, even at shallow depths. Batteries drain faster than expected, and headlamps occasionally flicker despite new cells. The temperature within these caves can drop sharply within meters, forming sudden walls of frost that seem almost sculpted. Many crews stop before proceeding far, fearing collapse, but the few who have gone deeper report that the floors are unnervingly smooth, as if shaped by something more deliberate than thaw and freeze. Measurements collected from these chambers rarely make sense. Carbon monoxide levels fluctuate without identifiable sources, and thermal readings sometimes suggest faint heat signatures moving beneath the ice. Instruments designed to record vibration pick up steady pulses, slow and rhythmic, that do not correspond to known geological activity. Yet when the data is reviewed later, portions of it appear corrupted, replaced with blank intervals or static. Scientists who study glaciology offer rational causes, shifting meltwater, hidden geothermal vents, but even they admit the precision of these patterns defies the chaotic nature of mountain ice. Those who have spent nights near these formations describe dreams of falling through endless white corridors, of whispers echoing through frozen stone. A few mountaineers, awakened by the wind, claim to hear what sounds like breathing beneath the snowfields, faint but steady. These accounts are often dismissed as exhaustion or altitude-induced illusion, yet they persist across regions and generations. The common thread is unease, the feeling that something beneath the surface is listening, waiting for silence to settle before moving again. Recovered items from vanished climbers add to the mystery. In several cases, objects have surfaced years later, far from where the individuals disappeared, carried by no known current or avalanche path. A single glove found intact on a glacier, a rope embedded in ice hundreds of feet from its last recorded use, or a camera case discovered with film undeveloped but unspoiled by moisture, all seem to trace faint outlines of movements that should have been impossible. For families, these findings bring neither closure nor clarity, only the haunting suggestion that what lies beneath may not always remain still. Every effort to probe the ice with radar and thermal scans meets the same fate: interference that obscures what lies beneath. Devices short out unexpectedly, and recorded data often returns blank, as if something absorbed the signal entirely. On more than one occasion, readings have shown concentrated pockets of heat that seem to move just below the crust, vanishing moments later. When the teams retrace their steps, the area appears unchanged, leaving behind no melt marks or fractures. The inconsistency has led to quiet speculation that the problem may not be mechanical at all, that the instruments might be reacting to something the ice itself does not wish to reveal. From time to time, explorers recount fleeting shapes seen through ice cracks, disappearing when approached. One mountaineer reported seeing a dim, humanoid form step just beyond a fractured tunnel, only for the opening to collapse moments later, leaving no trace of passage. Others describe faint patterns pressed into the snow, geometric and precise, as though someone or something had walked in strict formation before disappearing. These subtle signs are often dismissed as tricks of light or shifting snow, yet their consistency across decades and locations hints at phenomena that defy conventional explanation, as if the ice itself is selectively revealing fragments of a hidden reality. Within these mountains, where snow conceals both memory and evidence, the caves continue to open and close with the seasons, erasing the traces of every investigation. No one can say how many of them exist or how deep they go. Some remain visible for weeks before collapsing into themselves, while others may endure unseen for centuries beneath unbroken drifts. As climbers pass above without realizing, the ground below shifts, creating chambers that breathe, expand, and consume. And somewhere inside that ever-changing labyrinth of ice, the echoes of those who entered without return still seem to linger, waiting for the next thaw to reveal their frozen silence. As the glaciers shift beneath the moonlight, something unseen keeps its watch beneath the ice, patient as the mountain itself. The SOS incident, Mount Asahi, Japan. From above, the snowfield appeared undisturbed, an endless sweep of white framed by ridges of volcanic rock and wind-carved ice. The helicopter's observer scanned the terrain for signs of a missing climber reported days earlier, expecting to see only the shifting traces of weather. Instead, a shape caught his eye. Letters carved into the snow, massive and uneven, forming a desperate plea that read simply SOS. The sign stood out starkly against the untouched slope, each mark clean and deliberate, as though made by someone still hoping to be seen. The pilot circled, noting footprints that trailed off toward a dark cluster of trees before radioing for ground support to investigate. When ground teams reached the coordinates, the light had already begun to fade, and the cold pressed sharply against the ridgeline. The letters were real, cut deep and compact, their edges crisp even in the wind. Nearby, searchers found remnants of a camp half buried in the snow, a torn sleeping bag, a rusted cooking pot, and fragments of bone scattered in a shallow hollow. The remains were human, though no intact skeleton could be assembled from what lay there. The team marked the area, documented the find, and reported back to Sapporo, uncertain whether they had stumbled upon the victim they sought, or an altogether different story. Strangely, forensic analysis would soon reveal that the bones did not belong to the missing hiker whose case had prompted the search. The skeletal remains appeared much older, possibly years older, than the current disappearance, their condition inconsistent with recent exposure. The SOS sign, however, was fresh, carved within days of discovery, its sharp edges suggesting no more than a week's erosion. How an old skeleton came to rest beside a newly made distress signal became the central puzzle of what investigators would soon call the Mount Asahi SOS incident. Nearby, surveyors uncovered more unsettling details. A small camera was found wedged between rocks, its film still intact. When developed, the photograph showed mountain scenery, indistinct faces, and several blurred images of what appeared to be a snow-covered camp, though none contained the SOS sign. Scattered around the area were items that seemed unrelated: a wool cap, a plastic water bottle of a type discontinued years earlier, and a map marked with routes not officially listed on any tourist edition. The more objects the team catalogued, the less sense the timeline made, as if two entirely different expeditions had occupied the same ground at separate times. Authorities launched a detailed investigation, comparing dental records and equipment serial numbers to reports of missing persons across Hokkaido. The bones matched no active cases. News outlets speculated wildly. Some claimed the SOS had been a message from a long-lost mountaineer whose remains were only now uncovered. Others argued it was a hoax, staged by an unknown party for reasons no one could explain. Forensic specialists, meanwhile, pointed out that the skeletal remains bore marks consistent with prolonged exposure, but not enough to determine whether the individual had perished naturally or been buried deliberately beneath the snow. The report, issued months later, concluded only that a person unknown expired on site, circumstances undetermined. Strange markings found near the SOS site deepen the mystery. Tiny indentations in the snow, perfectly circular and aligned in straight rows, suggested the use of a tool or instrument, yet no equipment capable of producing such precise patterns was recovered. Some appeared to form geometric shapes that mirrored the outline of the SOS sign itself, hinting at repeated attempts to communicate or leave a record. Analysts who examined the site later proposed that these patterns could not have been made by casual passage or the wind, yet their purpose remained unknowable. The discovery raised unsettling questions. Was someone deliberately encoding a message alongside the SOS, or was it a lingering trace from a previous, unrelated expedition now converging with the scene? Glimpses of movement occasionally appeared on the upper slope, resembling figures that dissolved when approached. Shadows stretched unnaturally across ridges, and glints of metal or cloth appeared fleetingly in places inaccessible to ordinary climbers. Some team members swore they heard distant voices echoing in patterns that mimic the SOS letters, though no one could pinpoint a source. These fleeting impressions suggested that the mountain itself might preserve traces of past travellers, replaying moments like a ghostly echo that only manifests under certain conditions, further blurring the line between memory, signal, and reality. Further investigation revealed subtle traces that hinted at repeated human presence in impossible patterns. Footprints in the snow led toward the SOS site, but abruptly ended in mid-slope, only to reappear several meters away in directions that defied natural walking paths. Small clusters of rocks nearby appeared deliberately stacked, forming cairns that did not align with any known trails. Some searchers noted faint impressions, resembling handprints pressed into icy ledges, as if someone had braced against the mountain while vanishing from view. These anomalies suggested that the ridge may be a site of overlapping activity, both recent and historic, yet no coherent narrative could reconcile the evidence, leaving the mountain's secrets suspended between reality and speculation. Locals from nearby Asahikawa recalled earlier rumours of hikers vanishing on the same ridge during the late 1970s, before formal records were kept. Some remembered hearing that an amateur mountaineering group had once gone missing during a storm, their search abandoned after weeks of failure. In that version, one member supposedly returned years later to mark the place where the others had died. Others dismissed the idea as mountain folklore, a ghost story born of overlapping tragedies. Yet among the rescue teams, there was quiet talk that the SOS might have been carved by someone who discovered the bones, not the victim themselves, an act of memorial mistaken for a cry for help. Years later, climbers retracing the area for research found the outline of the SOS faintly visible beneath seasonal snowpack. It had partially collapsed into the slope, its edges blurred by time. Nearby, they discovered what seemed to be another inscription, almost erased, the letters indecipherable but deliberate. The find reignited speculation that the original message may have been part of a sequence, multiple attempts perhaps, or overlapping signals carved years apart. None of the follow-up studies could verify this, as snowmelt and wind erased the markings soon after. The site was eventually designated off-limits due to unstable terrain, sealing whatever remained beneath shifting layers of ice and ash. Beneath the mountain's still surface, unanswered questions endure. Who carved the plea into the snow, and when? Did its author hope to be saved, or to guide others to the remains below? The bones remain unidentified. The camera's final images yield no clue, and the mountain's silence continues to mock every conclusion drawn in its shadow. As hikers ascend Mount Asahi today, they pass the coordinates unknowingly, their footsteps pressing against layers of unrecorded history, each snowfall rewriting what little was ever known. Under the endless drift, a silence hums with intent, as if the ice itself remembers what we no longer can. The 1973 Mazama's Aconcagua expedition. At dawn, the base camp stirred with purposeful energy, the pale light of the Andes spilling across glaciers and jagged ridges. The Mazama's team had assembled with meticulous care, each member aware of the dangers that Aconcagua demanded. Supplies were checked, ropes coiled, and oxygen cylinders balanced carefully in packs. Even the seasoned climbers, familiar with high-altitude perils, paused to observe the wind's subtle shifts, noting the cold air that hinted at storms beyond the horizon. The mountain loomed above with indifferent authority, its snowfields vast and seemingly eternal, waiting to test the limits of human endurance. The climbers began their ascent along the normal route, their footsteps cutting a tentative path across hard-packed snow and scree. Conversations were sparse, each voice swallowed quickly by the mountain's vast, echoing expanse. As the hours passed, some noticed the wind behaving unpredictably, calm one moment then gusting with sudden force. Equipment rattled in packs, tents flapped at unusual angles, and small stones appeared to slide across slopes where none should. These early anomalies were dismissed as typical alpine quirks, yet a quiet tension began to grow among the group. By midday, condition worsened without warning. A low-hanging cloud enveloped the higher slopes, reducing visibility to mere meters. Members of the party reported hearing faint, irregular noises in the wind, indistinguishable from shifting ice or distant avalanches. One climber described what seemed like a rhythmic tapping echoing across the glacier, disappearing whenever anyone attempted to locate its source. The team's pace slowed as crevasse lines became harder to discern and temperature readings dropped, faster than anticipated. Somewhere on the upper slopes, the first of the climbers' tracks vanished abruptly, leaving only pristine snow beyond a certain point, as though swallowed by the mountain itself. Search teams were deployed immediately after the group failed to report their scheduled check-ins. Helicopters combed the slopes, but the mountain's scale rendered aerial observation unreliable. Crews on foot encountered pockets of unusual snow behavior, areas that appeared solid from above yet collapsed under minimal weight, and depressions that led to nothing but ice and shadow. Despite repeated sweeps, no bodies were found, only scattered remnants of clothing and equipment left behind as if deliberately abandoned. Each finding deepened the mystery, challenging assumptions about survival, navigation, and the mountain's relentless neutrality. Scattered across the upper camps, searchers recovered ropes frozen mid-hang, footprints that ended abruptly, and a small diary belonging to one of the climbers. The entries detailed routine observations, route adjustments, and weather conditions, yet in the final pages, the writing became irregular, almost frantic. The author described voices in the wind and shadows that move against the slope, moments of unease that the mountain itself seemed to magnify. These fragments of evidence offered no coherent explanation for the disappearance, only an unsettling sense of deliberate isolation, as if the terrain had conspired to erase the team's passage. Subtle anomalies in the terrain were noted repeatedly during later surveys. Snow formations appeared sculpted in unnatural patterns, depressions suggesting movement contradicted expected gravitational behavior, and ice ridges sometimes formed apparent pathways that led to nowhere. Guides reported that footprints, when they did appear, seemed compressed in one location and then vanished entirely, as if the snow itself resisted recording human passage. These features were inconsistent across the slopes, yet multiple independent observations confirmed their existence, suggesting that Aconcagwa's upper reaches may behave in ways that confound conventional understanding of high-altitude terrain. According to journals and later testimonies from surviving guides, the group had split at certain points to move faster across crevasses and avoid sudden snowdrifts. Yet timelines recorded in personal notes conflicted with one another. Departure times did not match observed positions, and some members reported witnessing events that others denied. This discordance left investigators puzzled, suggesting either errors induced by altitude and exhaustion, or a series of misperceptions so precise that they created an unresolvable web of inconsistencies. The mountain, in effect, had become a labyrinth not only of ice and stone, but of human observation itself. Unexplained signals recorded by portable radios during the search added another layer of perplexity. Teams reported brief bursts of static interrupted by faint, indecipherable voices that seemed to echo from no identifiable direction. Some signals even appeared to repeat phrases from earlier log entries, as if the mountain itself had intercepted and distorted them. Attempts to triangulate the source yielded inconsistent coordinates, often placing the signal in impossible locations across crevasses or mid-air above ridges. The phenomenon remained entirely unverified, yet multiple independent teams reported it, leaving a lingering suspicion that something beyond the ordinary had influenced both the expedition's disappearance and the subsequent rescue efforts. Even wildlife responded strangely to the areas associated with disappearances. Condors that normally circled thermals high above avoided certain ridges, and smaller animals that should inhabit lower scree fields were conspicuously absent. Observers also noted peculiar atmospheric effects, sudden gusts funneling through narrow ice corridors, pockets of dense fog forming inexplicably, and echoes that did not align with physical formations. These environmental oddities coincided with points where climbers vanished, hinting that natural phenomena may interact with perception, movement, or both in a way that leaves no conventional trace. Amid these anomalies, climbers occasionally reported fleeting figures along distant ridges, moving with a precision that defied wind or snow, vanishing whenever approached. Whispers carried on the thin air, unintelligible yet unmistakably human, seemed to replay fragments of the expedition itself. These eerie impressions suggested that Aconcagua might retain an imprint of those who vanished, a spectral memory embedded in ice, stone and atmosphere, observed only by those who dared traverse the mountain's upper reaches. Decades later, researchers returned to the area to map the upper slopes with modern instruments, hoping to clarify what had happened. Satellite imagery revealed subtle indentations and formations where the expedition likely passed, but no new remains or equipment were located. Snowmelt had erased most physical traces, leaving only faint impressions that hinted at movement, yet offered no answers. Oral accounts persisted. Climbers and guides claimed that even now, the sound of wind along certain ridges resembles footsteps in hollow snow, or faint shouts carried briefly before vanishing. The mountain's history had accumulated another layer of unresolved disappearance, a case recorded in logs but unresolved in reality. Among the peaks, Aconcagua retains its indifferent silence. The traces of the Mazamas expedition have largely vanished beneath decades of snow, wind and avalanche, yet the story continues to echo among those who traverse the mountain. Each ascent is shadowed by the knowledge that the upper slopes once claimed an entire team without leaving a full explanation. The mountain does not reveal its reasoning, nor does it offer mercy. The paths once trodden by the climbers have disappeared, leaving only the whisper of their presence frozen into the ridgeline, a reminder that even the most prepared humans remain vulnerable to its immutable, icy authority. On those cold slopes, the vanished hikers' paths remain concealed, leaving only the mountain to decide their fate. Unexplained disappearances in Rocky Mountain National Park are missed cases. Amid towering pines and jagged ridges, the Rocky Mountains stretch across Colorado with breathtaking majesty, their vast valleys and hidden gullies offering both refuge and peril. The park, celebrated for its trails, alpine lakes and dramatic vistas, also harbours stories seldom told in guidebooks. Over decades, hikers, campers and climbers have vanished without a trace, leaving families, rangers and investigators grasping for explanations that never fully materialise. While many disappearances have mundane causes, sudden storms, treacherous footing or wildlife encounters, some resist logic entirely, their circumstances as enigmatic as the peaks themselves. One early morning in the 1970s, a family setting out for a short trail near Glacier Gorge failed to return. Rangers combed the area for days, following tracks that ended abruptly at the edge of a rocky outcrop. No bodies were found, and no signs of a struggle were visible. Only a lone hiking boot, wedged between boulders and partially covered in moss, hinted at the presence of humans. Subsequent searches over several seasons turned up nothing further. Even decades later, the area retains an uncanny stillness that some hikers describe as oppressive, as if the forest itself remembers what occurred there and refuses to speak. Along shadowed ridges, other cases present equally baffling details. In the early 1980s, a solo climber ascending a lesser-known peak vanished during a routine expedition. His campsite was discovered intact, meals uneaten, equipment neatly arranged, yet he was gone. Searchers found faint footprints leading into a narrow, overgrown ravine. Then nothing. No continuation of the trail, no indication of the direction he might have taken. Investigators noted the absence of animal activity that could explain a sudden disappearance, and the wind patterns that day could not account for the erasure of tracks in that terrain. At moments, only a sliver of the trail is overtaken by chill or fog, the rest of the forest holding its silence. In several disappearance cases, witnesses recalled hearing distant voices or indistinct calls carried by the wind, sometimes repeating phrases from previous hikers or conversations that had taken place days earlier. These phenomena are difficult to verify scientifically, yet they recur enough to unsettle search teams, suggesting that the park may possess zones where environmental behaviour deviates from expectation, subtly interfering with human perception and navigation. In recent years, the pattern has persisted. A young couple attempting a multi-day trek near Long's Peak disappeared amidst severe weather, leaving behind a collapsed tent and a backpack containing personal items. Rangers discovered footprints in deep snow, some pointing toward a cliffside, others veering inexplicably back toward the starting trailhead. Drone and satellite surveys revealed subtle depressions in snow and soil, but nothing concrete. Each search yielded anomalies that defied standard explanations, from partially buried clothing in areas not affected by avalanches to footprints that seem to vanish mid-step. Scattered remnants from several cases amplify the mystery. A hiking pole found embedded upright in a shallow stream, a pair of gloves atop a boulder far from the nearest trail, and a partially torn map discovered in a hollow tree all suggest human presence yet provide no narrative of what transpired. Rangers catalogue these items meticulously, yet each fragment only deepens the sense that something about the terrain or the conditions allows people to disappear without leaving coherent traces. Such findings challenge expectations about survival and movement within the park, blurring the line between accident and something less tangible. Certain irregularities appear as subtle anomalies in the terrain itself. Rocks appear slightly displaced when revisited. Tree branches bend in ways that seem unnatural, and shallow depressions form overnight in areas previously undisturbed. In certain spots, trails seem to shift orientation, and landmarks once memorized appear in different positions. These changes are rarely captured on camera or recorded by GPS, yet multiple independent accounts confirm their existence, suggesting that the landscape may subtly rearrange itself around those who traverse it. Field studies reveal that wildlife behaves unusually near disappearance sites. Deer and smaller mammals avoid paths where hikers have vanished, while predator tracks appear nearby but show no signs of interaction with humans. Birds fall silent in sections of forest otherwise alive with song, and wind patterns carry sound inconsistently, sometimes muting calls or amplifying distant noises in impossible ways. Combined, these factors create an environment in which human presence can be distorted, erased or diverted, reinforcing the sense that certain zones within the park resist conventional understanding and conceal more than just physical space. Park rangers describe the investigative challenges in painstaking detail. Limited visibility in dense forests, rapidly shifting weather, and difficult terrain constrain searches. Witness reports are often conflicting, with hikers recalling seeing figures in one location, while others report emptiness in the same area. Communication devices frequently fail in higher elevations, and small snow or rock slides can erase critical evidence before teams arrive. Even with modern technology, the park retains areas where human presence can vanish almost entirely, leaving behind nothing but unsettled questions and fleeting impressions. Strikingly, across decades and distances within the park, certain consistencies emerge. Disappearances often occur near watercourses, ridgelines, or hidden depressions where terrain can change subtly between seasons. Items are occasionally found carefully placed rather than scattered chaotically, suggesting that something or someone interacts with the environment in ways investigators cannot reconstruct. Observers note a heightened sense of isolation and disorientation among hikers near these zones, even when visibility and weather conditions should be clear. The convergence of these factors creates a landscape where the normal rules of cause and effect seem suspended. In one unusual case, a ranger discovered a partially intact campsite high on a slope where snow and rock slides should have obliterated all traces. Equipment was arranged meticulously, as though someone had paused and stepped away, yet no footprints led to or from the site. Nearby, subtle depressions in the soil suggested movement in patterns too precise to be natural, yet no human presence was ever recorded. These anomalies challenge even seasoned investigators, leaving the possibility that some disappearances are influenced by forces or circumstances the mountains concealed deliberately, preserving their secrets beyond reach. Within the wilderness, Rocky Mountain National Park maintains its silent authority. Trails wind through valleys and ascend peaks that have witnessed centuries of human endeavour and disappearance alike. Each season, new hikers traverse the same paths once trodden by those who vanished, unknowingly brushing against the legacy of past mysteries. Forests, cliffs, and hidden glades absorb their presence, shifting imperceptibly to hide what came before. For families and investigators, the park offers no closure, only the persistent sense that, in certain places, people can enter and leave without a trace, and that the mountains themselves hold their secrets close. In the dim folds of valleys and along narrow ridges, the missing remain hidden, with only silent echoes marking their absence. Mountain trails that erase hikers. Twisting through the ridge, the trails of the Rocky Mountains wind unpredictably between forests, cliffs, and hidden ravines. Each switchback can feel deceptively familiar one moment and alien the next, as if the mountain reshapes itself in response to each step. Hikers follow worn paths only to discover that the trail behind them no longer resembles the one they came from, and landmarks vanish as quickly as they are noticed. The park's extensive network of routes, while mapped and maintained in parts, contains stretches so remote and convoluted that navigation relies as much on instinct as on maps. In these areas, countless individuals have disappeared over the decades, leaving only questions and faint impressions where they once travelled. In the early 1960s, a pair of college students set out along the Deer Mountain Trail and never returned. Search parties found their campsite abandoned, with boots lined neatly at the tent flap, packs untouched, and a small journal listing their intended route. Footprints led into a dense grove and abruptly ceased, as if swallowed by the earth. Investigators scoured the surrounding terrain but found nothing to explain the sudden cessation. The only anomaly recorded was a patch of snow that persisted unusually late into spring, in which the trail seemed to curve in impossible ways. Over time, the story became part of the park's quiet lore, a warning whispered among those who venture into isolated trails. Sharp bends and narrow gullies make certain sections particularly treacherous. Loose shale shifts beneath feet without warning, and hidden gullies or sinkholes can appear where none were visible on previous excursions. Fog and low clouds frequently descend into these zones, obscuring the path entirely and creating a disorienting effect known as whiteout corridors, where even seasoned hikers can lose their bearings. In multiple cases, searchers discovered that trails once memorized seemed to transform. Cairns misaligned, trees appearing closer or farther than expected, and natural sound reflecting oddly, masking calls for help. The landscape itself appears to resist precise measurement, as though these trails were designed to mislead anyone moving through them. More recently, a solo hiker on the Wild Basin Loop vanished on a clear day. Witnesses who had passed her earlier recalled seeing her confident stride along the path, yet hours later she was gone. Her gear, including a fully stocked pack and a functioning GPS device, was later found abandoned at a ridge, but the device's tracks ended abruptly with no indication of deviation or technical failure. Park rangers combed nearby gullies, hidden groves, and cliffside ledges, finding only faint impressions in soil too shallow to suggest sustained movement. Even aerial surveys using drones and infrared technology failed to locate further evidence, leaving an unsettling conclusion that the trail itself seemed to have absorbed her. Unusual atmospheric shifts occasionally carve the trail into isolated stretches, distinct from the surrounding land. Sudden wind gusts funnel through narrow canyons, carrying sounds that appear distorted or amplified, while fog pockets linger stubbornly in one spot, masking paths completely. In several disappearances, hikers reported feeling a strange stillness, where birds fell silent and distant waterfalls seemed muted. These conditions often coincide with trails where footprints vanish or gear reappears in unexpected locations, suggesting that localized atmospheric anomalies may interact with the terrain in ways that obscure or erase human presence. Abandoned packs, water bottles, and torn maps recovered along these paths often carry hints without context. One backpack found near the base of an isolated cliff contained a neatly folded jacket and an untouched thermos, but no indication of who left it or why. In another instance, a pair of boots appeared positioned as if paused mid-step, embedded shallowly in soil that had no tracks leading to them. These items suggest intentional placement, yet no footprints or signs of struggle accompany them. Each artifact raises new questions. Were these remnants the result of natural forces, human intervention, or something less tangible that the mountains conceal? Travelers recount experiences that defy simple explanation. Some describe a sense of vertigo and spatial distortion, perceiving cliffs, streams, or boulders in places they had just passed. Others report hearing voices, footsteps, or laughter that vanish when investigated. Hikers occasionally speak of trails that loop back on themselves or diverge in ways impossible according to maps. Many dismiss these experiences as fatigue or psychological stress at high elevation, yet the consistency across decades and varying individuals suggests a pattern too persistent to ignore. The mountains seem to hold subtle cues that mislead the mind, bending perception along narrow corridors of rock and forest. In certain areas, wildlife behavior adds to the sense of anomaly. Animals, typically active near trails, are sometimes conspicuously absent where hikers vanish, while tracks of predators appear nearby yet seem unrelated to human movement. Rangers have noted that deer, elk, and smaller mammals often skirt around specific sections of path as if responding to something unseen. These behavioural oddities, when paired with vanishing tracks and sudden disorientation reported by humans, create a compounding puzzle. The environment itself seems to shift subtly, exerting influence over both the natural and human inhabitants in ways that remain unexplained. Rangers report that conducting searches on these trails challenges even the most experienced teams. Shifting snow, rock slides, and dense foliage frequently erase tracks within hours. Communication devices are often unreliable due to the surrounding topography, and GPS signals can fluctuate unpredictably along narrow valleys. Teams must contend with steep climbs, hidden gullies, and sudden storms that appear with no forecast. In many cases, by the time rescuers reach the area, natural processes have removed almost all evidence, leaving only fragments of clothing or gear as faint testimony to those who vanished. Even now, hikers who traverse these trails speak of a subtle tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that the path may not lead where it should. The forest can shift silently, fog can gather without warning, and gullies appear in places that seemed solid minutes before. Those who disappear are never fully accounted for, their presence reduced to fleeting shadows and the occasional artifact left behind. The trails themselves retain an enduring, almost sentient secrecy, suggesting that in certain corners of the Rocky Mountains, the act of walking becomes an invitation to vanish. Between visits, it has been recorded that subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in the landscape itself, rocks that seem to move slightly between visits, tree branches subtly reoriented, and soil that appeared freshly pressed in impossible patterns. In a few cases, even landmarks once considered reliable, such as distinctive boulders or lone pine trees, seem to relocate when observed from the same vantage point. These anomalies, while never captured definitively on camera, suggest that the trails do not remain fixed, adding a layer of unpredictability that confounds memory, maps, and even technological tracking. Through the serpentine trails, the peaks watch over every step, allowing only some to endure while others fade into nothing. High-altitude strangeness, soundless winds, and vanishing echoes. On the upper slopes of the Rocky Mountains, the air itself seems to hold its breath. Hikers recount moments when the usual rush of wind across ridges falls into sudden, unnatural calm. Birds that should chatter among stunted pines remain silent, and distant waterfalls are reduced to whispers, or vanish entirely from perception. One seasoned mountaineer described reaching a narrow saddle, only to notice that the echoes of his own footsteps ceased as though the mountain had absorbed them. In these high, isolated passes, sound can behave unpredictably, bending and fading in ways that seem impossible to map or explain, yet the moments are precise, sudden, and chilling. In the shadow of Mount Princeton, a small group of climbers reported a peculiar phenomenon while ascending toward the Arkansas River headwaters. As they reached a jagged outcrop, the wind that had been howling moments before fell abruptly silent. One hiker, calling out to his companion, received no echo, not even the faintest return. By the time the others turned to find him, he had vanished from the narrow ledge entirely. Searchers combed the immediate slopes, their voices filling the air, yet the man was gone, leaving behind only his pack and a pair of gloves on the rock. The suddenness of his disappearance defied the logical patterns of avalanches, slides, or exposure, and the calm itself became as enigmatic as the void where he'd stood. Multiple accounts from the Front Range and Wind River peaks tell of similar disorienting silences. Experienced hikers speak of a premonitory stillness that descends just before someone disappears, a pause in sound that feels deliberate, as if the mountain is quietly assessing its visitors. One park ranger noted that these events often coincide with areas where terrain funnels or forms natural amphitheatres, locations where acoustics behave unpredictably, yet the consistency across isolated cases hints at something far stranger than echo anomalies. Maps and topographical studies provide no explanation, and photographs of the area show no visual anomaly. Only the witnesses' recollections preserve the unnatural hush, a void that lingers longer than any memory of wind or footsteps. Even in wide alpine meadows, where the expectation is of open sound carrying across valleys, hikers have described moments of profound silence. A trail guide in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains recalled leading a group along a ridge when the chatter of conversation simply vanished. Radios and phones ceased to transmit properly, Static filled the air, but no voice could pass. When the guide turned to check on the trailing hiker, she had disappeared into a mist that was thin, almost insubstantial, yet dense enough to obscure all trace. Searchers returned later, finding only a faint imprint in frost-laden grass, the pattern too shallow to have supported a human's weight for long. The sudden muting of the environment seemed to coincide perfectly with the loss of a person, a pattern repeated too often to dismiss entirely. Geologists and atmospheric scientists acknowledge that mountain microclimates can create pockets of still air or localized fog, and while these phenomena can explain certain disorienting conditions, they fail to account for the sheer precision and the eerie timing of the vanishings. One climatologist who studied reports from the Saurwatch Range noted that in no recorded instance did these pockets of silence extend beyond a few dozen meters, yet each disappearance occurred within the bounds of this inexplicable calm. Witnesses describe a sensation of the environment holding its breath, a phrase that recurs across multiple accounts and regions, suggesting something more than random weather patterns. Beyond the immediate hush, hikers often report that other senses falter simultaneously. The scent of pine or earth disappears, and distant visual markers like rock formations or tree lines seem to waver or vanish altogether. One mountaineer in the northern Rockies recalled hearing nothing, seeing nothing, and feeling no resistance when he stumbled into a shallow depression. Yet by the time he regained his bearings, he was a quarter-mile down the trail with no recollection of the intervening moments. Such accounts complicate the idea of simple disorientation. They suggest a phenomenon that affects perception itself, rather than merely the environment. Historical records hint that these events are not purely modern. A diary from a 1892 surveying expedition near Pikes Peak mentions an assistant who vanished into the mountain silence, leaving only a dropped compass behind. Early mountaineers repeatedly describe periods when instruments failed to function correctly, when echoes did not respond, and when the wind itself seemed to retreat from certain peaks. These anomalies were once chalked up to altitude sickness or imagination, but the striking parallels to modern accounts imply that the mountains possess qualities that have persisted for centuries, unnoticed and largely unrecorded. Emergency response teams and search parties are often baffled by the lack of physical evidence in these vanishings. Tracks seem to dissolve, backpacks are left in locations inconsistent with expected movement, and even scent trails are interrupted in ways that defy natural explanation. Despite decades of study, no single theory accounts for all aspects: sudden disappearance, environmental silence, perceptual distortion, and partial evidence left behind. Each case reinforces the notion that these high-altitude anomalies are selective, precise, and profoundly isolating, reminding those who remain of the mountain's unpredictable authority. In a few instances, climbers reported instruments failing in concert with the silence. Altimeters fluctuated wildly, GPS devices blinked with impossible coordinates, and compasses wavered as if repelled by unseen forces. Some hikers noted that even the normally reliable behavior of clouds and shadows seemed to warp, altering the perception of distance and slope. These subtle but consistent anomalies suggest that the high-altitude strangeness affects not only sound and sight, but the very tools relied upon to navigate, leaving travelers vulnerable in a way that defies conventional understanding. Travelers still push into these remote heights, captivated by their grandeur, yet mindful of the mysteries that have claimed so many before them. Guides warn newcomers about sudden silences, unusual fog, and the odd ways echoes can vanish, treating these precautions as ritual rather than superstition. Even so, the mountain's mysteries endure, quietly shaping stories that blur the line between natural oddity and inexplicable disappearance, leaving every new ascent tinged with tension, as if the terrain itself decides who may traverse it safely and who may be swallowed into its silent embrace. On the exposed heights beyond the tree line, those who vanish linger, leaving only the strange hush that seems to anticipate their erasure. The twin brothers in the Rockies. The sun had barely crested the jagged peaks when the twin brothers set out from the small cabin their family rented on the edge of a high valley. Their packs were light but neatly arranged, water bottles gleaming in the first rays and maps of the local trails tucked carefully into outer pockets. Locals had always spoken of this part of the Rockies with caution: steep ridges, sudden drop-offs, and narrow paths that could swallow even the most experienced hiker. but the twins had grown up exploring these slopes, their confidence bordering on recklessness. That morning, the wind carried no warning, only the crisp clarity of a new day, yet the mountains themselves seemed to watch as the brothers disappeared along the thin ribbon of trail that snaked upward into the mist. Their father's warning echoed in the morning mist as he watched them leave, to stick together, to remain within sight, to avoid straying from marked paths. The twins waved back with familiar certainty, laughing as though they had never heard it. Residents recalled how the boys' energy had always been boundless, a restless curiosity that pushed them toward every cliff, every ridge, every secret hollow the forest might conceal. Yet hours later their absence began to weigh on those who knew them. The trail, once lively with footsteps, carried only the faint impression of a pair who had vanished almost before they had truly entered the wilderness. By the time the trail narrowed, the twins had vanished from each other's sight. 1 minute they were side by side, joking and pointing at a distant falcon circling the canyon, and the next, one brother stumbled on a rock and turned back only to find his twin gone. He called out, but the voice seemed to dissolve into the morning air, swallowed by the slope and the dense spruce. The rocky ground was jagged, unforgiving, yet offered no trace of struggle. Searchers later noted that the footprints along the ridge were inconsistent, sometimes appearing as though a single step had leapt several feet, or fading entirely where they should have continued. Search parties fanned out, finding only scattered packs and footprints that ended abruptly. Helicopters skimmed the ridges, hikers combed narrow gullies, and trackers followed leads along the valley floor, yet the brothers were nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks with no sign beyond the gear left behind, one backpack atop a mossy boulder, a water bottle caught in a juniper bush, a jacket draped over a branch as if placed deliberately. The strange spacing of these items, separated by miles yet discovered along logical routes, confounded rescuers. Nothing indicated the twins had suffered injury or misfortune. Nothing suggested anyone else had been present. The evidence pointed to a disappearance both immediate and deliberate, and the searchers could only stare in disbelief at the wilderness that had consumed them. Local hunters spoke of seeing strange disturbances in the forest, too brief to track, shadows moving in the underbrush, fleeting glimpses of two figures on ridges far apart from the expected trail, and odd sounds that could not be attributed to wind or wildlife. Some dismissed these sightings as misperception or rumour, yet the consistency of the reports suggested otherwise. A few hikers who ventured into the same areas afterwards spoke of a disquieting feeling, an awareness that the terrain was watching, that it remembered the twins' passage and reacted in silence. In these accounts, the mountains themselves seemed to dictate where a person might travel and where they might vanish. Maps and GPS coordinates failed to reconcile the locations of their discovered gear. A jacket left near a narrow creek appeared almost 20 miles from a backpack found along the ridge, the terrain between them impossible to traverse within the time available. Rescue teams speculated about human error, sudden storms, or disorientation, but the evidence refused to fit. Even technological tracking failed. Phones had no signal in the area, and compasses occasionally spun unpredictably when approaching certain ridge lines. Whatever had claimed the twins left only traces that confounded reason, leaving questions that persisted long after the searchers returned home. Stories whispered in the nearby town recalled similar vanishings decades prior. Elder residents spoke of hikers who had gone missing along the same peaks, of children who strayed too far from summer camps, of lone climbers who were never found. These stories were retold with hushed voices, a mixture of fear and fascination, as though the mountains themselves were known to hold the souls of those who disappeared within them. Some theorized that hidden caves or crevices swallowed intruders. Others suggested that the wilderness might harbor pockets of disorientation, a labyrinth of sheer rock and shadow that no human could fully navigate. Yet no theory ever fully accounted for the twins' vanishing. Officials could only speculate as to how the brothers' paths had diverged so inexplicably. Reports indicated they had begun together, followed the same trail markers, and maintained eye contact until the moment one simply vanished from view. Terrain analyses, weather data, and historical trail records were consulted, but no pattern emerged. The mountains, in their immensity, seemed indifferent to maps, GPS readings, or the logic of search teams. For the parents, the ambiguity was unbearable. To know their children had disappeared without struggle, without evidence, without closure, offered neither solace nor understanding. Even years later, hikers recount the eerie sense of being watched along that ridge. Photographs taken on later trips show only empty slopes and shadows that do not match any natural formation. Backpackers speak of sudden chills, fleeting glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, and the unsettling sensation that the mountain itself remembers those it has claimed. The twin story has entered local lore, a cautionary tale whispered around cabins and campfires, yet one with an unresolved weight that leaves no comfort for those who dare imagine what truly occurred. Strangely, some later expeditions noted minor anomalies in the environment that coincided with the twins' last known path. Small depressions in the soil that appeared suddenly and then disappeared, crushed vegetation forming fleeting patterns, and faint unexplained impressions on rock surfaces that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Even trained trackers admitted that these subtle signs offered no practical clues, yet they hinted at a force or presence that interacted with the terrain itself, altering it in ways imperceptible to conventional observation and leaving only the sense that the mountains retained a memory of the brothers' passage. The mountains eventually reclaim their quiet, and the twin brothers remain a haunting absence scattered across ridges and valleys, their fate sealed within the silent, unyielding wilds. The mystery of wandering runners. Runners vanished suddenly along the winding ridges of the La Plata Mountains. Trails that had once been familiar became treacherous overnight, or so it seemed to the locals who remembered the stories. One morning, a pair of marathon enthusiasts set out along a popular ascent, yet only one returned, breathless and disoriented, claiming to have lost track of his companion, as if the trail itself had shifted. Searchers combed the slopes, but no trace of the missing runner was ever recovered. Over time, patterns emerged. Disappearances were clustered, often occurring along narrow paths, steep gullies, or areas where fog rolled unpredictably. Each event carried the same unsettling quality, a sudden vanishing without struggle or explanation. The logs from search teams suggested that many of the missing disappeared within a surprisingly short period. Young and seasoned runners alike vanished in remarkably similar circumstances. Authorities noted that many were experienced in mountain terrain, familiar with maps and compass navigation, yet each had become inexplicably lost. Reports indicated that the missing were sometimes separated by only a few minutes, yet left no footprints beyond a short distance, no evidence of injury, and no personal items other than water bottles or hats strewn along the trails. It was as if the mountains themselves had chosen the moment and manner of their disappearance. On the narrow trail above the creek, only shoes and water bottles remained. In one case, a runner's shoes were found atop a moss-covered rock ledge, facing a drop-off that rescue teams deemed impassable without climbing equipment. Nearby, a water bottle rested on the forest floor as if the person had vanished mid-stride. Searchers could reconstruct no logical path connecting these items, leaving the terrain itself as a silent witness to something unexplainable. In other instances, items were found miles apart, sometimes days after the disappearance, suggesting a phenomenon that defied the expected limitations of distance and time. Patterns emerged, suggesting the vanishings were tied to specific atmospheric conditions. Sudden fog banks would envelop only a small section of the trail, leaving the surrounding area clear, while temperatures dropped sharply, chilling the hikers to the bone. Witnesses spoke of moments when the wind fell strangely silent, or when the rhythmic sound of footsteps vanished despite solid ground beneath their feet. These microclimatic anomalies could not be fully explained by topographical analysis, and yet they seemed to coincide with the most disorienting events, as though the mountains themselves were capable of manipulating perception. Fellow runners described a sudden disorientation, as though the trail itself had shifted beneath their feet. One recounted a sensation of moving uphill while his surroundings appeared to flatten, or glimpsing a familiar bend that seemed unfamiliar when reached. Others reported the same fleeting shadows at the edge of their vision, figures that moved with no discernible source. While some of these accounts could be dismissed as hallucinations or fear-induced misperception, the consistency across independent reports suggested an eerie and tangible pattern. Though every contour had been charted, the gaps in evidence resisted explanation. Trails had been well documented, GPS coordinates confirmed, and yet items appeared in locations inconsistent with human movement. In one documented case, a runner's water bottle was found along a ridge that would have required traversing nearly 2 miles of rugged terrain in less than 10 minutes, a feat impossible under normal circumstances. Authorities, perplexed by these anomalies, began cataloguing cases, noting locations, distances and conditions with meticulous care, attempting to discern any clue that could illuminate the truth. Without a moment's notice, a wall of mist rose around each person, separating them in silence. Some hikers described the sensation of being followed or watched, a subtle awareness that they were not alone, even when the terrain was empty. Trail markers appeared to shift or disappear entirely, leaving even experienced guides unsure of their bearings. In many cases, the vanished were last seen approaching sections of trail where steep inclines and narrow ridges offered few natural explanations for sudden loss. The combination of isolation, treacherous terrain, and unaccountable fog created conditions in which a person could vanish without leaving a trace, yet the repeated clustering of incidents suggested that chance alone could not be the cause. Experts studying the cases were struck by the pattern: clustered times, clustered locations, but no common culprit. Statistical analysis revealed anomalies beyond normal accident rates, hinting at a phenomenon that targeted a specific type of traveller, often physically fit, familiar with the mountains, and travelling along popular paths. Some theorised about disorientation caused by magnetic anomalies or rare atmospheric events, while others posited the influence of predatory wildlife or even human interference. Yet no single theory could encompass all disappearances, particularly when entire sections of the trail showed no evidence of struggle or human presence. Stories of the wandering runner persist among local hikers and guides, recounted carefully decades after the sightings. Local legends have grown alongside documented reports, warning newcomers to stick to main routes, to never run alone, and to heed the unpredictable moods of the mountains. Trail maps are now annotated with cautionary notes, and search teams remain vigilant, yet the mystery endures. The disappearances serve as a chilling reminder that the Rockies are not merely a place of challenge and beauty, but also a domain where the ordinary rules of navigation and experience can be suspended, leaving even the most prepared hikers vulnerable. Delicate clues hinted at motion beyond explanation, rocks scratched askew from the expected path, twigs strewn in impossible formations, and fleeting footprints that seemed to vanish into nothing. In some cases, wildlife tracks, normally abundant, were absent in areas where animals should have been present, as if the disappearance of the runners coincided with a broader silence in the ecosystem. These peculiar clues added another layer of mystery, suggesting that whatever claimed the runners might leave behind only cryptic traces, teasing investigators without ever revealing the full story. The trails remain winding and alluring, but the runners who vanished are never seen again, swallowed by ridges and fog, their fates locked within a pattern the mountains continue to repeat. Mountain disappearances and the missing 411 pattern. Across North America's highlands, investigators began noticing a disturbing pattern. Individual cases of missing hikers, campers and climbers had always been tragic yet seemingly isolated, but as reports accumulated, clusters emerged. Certain trails, ridges and remote lakes seemed to harbour an inexplicable frequency of disappearances. Analysts compiling decades of records discovered that these incidents were not random. They followed subtle, almost imperceptible correlations in geography, season and circumstance. The more the investigators dug, the more a framework emerged, one that would later be compiled under the title Missing 411, a catalogue chronicling disappearances that defied conventional explanation. Data collected from countless missing hiker reports revealed clusters in both time and location. Summer months accounted for most incidents, but even within that period the timing was precise. Mornings on certain trails, late afternoons near specific ridgelines, and evenings along isolated lake shores. Geographical hotspots recurred across different states, including the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, and the Cascades. Within these zones, hikers vanished alone or in pairs, leaving behind backpacks, shoes, or other personal items, but often no trace of their passage. The pattern suggested that something more than chance or misfortune governed these disappearances. Certain parks and ridges appeared with uncanny frequency in the records. In some locations, multiple cases were recorded over just a few years, while surrounding areas remained remarkably free of incident. Analysts noted that the missing individuals were often experienced in wilderness navigation, carrying maps, GPS devices, and proper equipment. The terrain itself, while difficult, did not account for the abrupt cessation of tracks or the sudden disappearance of entire groups. In these corridors, investigators found the boundaries of ordinary explanation stretched thin, as if the mountains themselves enforced their own rules of engagement. Age, experience level, and even group size were catalogued, yet the disappearances defied expectation. Children, teens, and adults of varying skill levels vanished in circumstances that yielded little consistency aside from the location clusters. Solo hikers were lost in moments of calm, families disappeared near remote lakes, and seasoned mountaineers were never found along established ridgelines. The sheer diversity of victims suggested a phenomenon unconcerned with skill or caution, a force that was selective yet indiscriminate, precise yet unpredictable. Unexpected patterns emerged when examining the victims' last known activities. Many had paused near streams, meadows, or small clearings, often for no apparent reason, only to vanish within moments. Others were found to have been travelling during periods of unusual solar or magnetic activity, though no direct correlation could be established. These subtle coincidences, though insufficient to form a concrete theory, hinted at environmental or temporal factors that might influence the disappearances. Analysts began noting these micropatterns in the missing 411 database, searching for trends invisible to casual observers, yet potentially critical to understanding the phenomenon. Officials reviewing case files noted anomalies that blurred the line between accident and impossibility. In many reports, trails ended abruptly, footprints dissolved, and items of clothing or gear were discovered miles from the nearest logical route. Search dogs sometimes failed to pick up the scent, even in areas where the terrain should have preserved it. Helicopters found nothing, and ranger patrols confirmed the absence of any evidence that could indicate animal predation or sudden misadventure. The disappearances seemed to occupy a space where known hazards could not fully explain the outcomes. Geographic mapping revealed corridors where individuals vanished under circumstances that repeated too precisely to ignore. Certain valleys and high passes produced multiple cases within the same season or year. Analysts noted proximity to natural features, thin ridges, isolated clearings, and lakes fed by narrow creeks. Yet even these correlations could not account for the full extent of the pattern. Some vanishings occurred on broad slopes far from cliffs or treacherous footing, leaving investigators to question whether terrain alone could explain the events or whether unseen forces influenced the outcomes. Witness accounts often described common environmental conditions, from sudden fog to unusual terrain shifts. In one case, a hiker reported a low, rolling mist that appeared only along a short stretch of trail, obscuring all vision beyond 10 feet. In another, climbers described a ridge that felt inexplicably elongated, the landscape seeming to move beneath their feet. While individual experiences might have been dismissed as perception errors, the consistency of these descriptions across multiple clusters hinted at a repeating influence, one that might subtly disorient or divert those who entered these zones. In several cases, search teams discovered evidence that defied conventional explanation. Clothing or personal items were sometimes arranged neatly, as if placed deliberately, rather than scattered in the chaos expected from an accident. In other instances, footprints led to the edge of a cliff or steep incline but stopped abruptly, with no sign of a fall or disturbance. These details, catalogued meticulously by investigators, added another layer of puzzling consistency to the missing 411 pattern. While such findings were rare, their repetition across multiple clusters reinforced the notion that the disappearances were guided by unseen forces rather than random misfortune. Researchers compiling historical reports found similar clusters dating back decades, suggesting a long-standing phenomenon. Journals, ranger logs, and early newspaper articles chronicled hikers who vanished along specific highland corridors, leaving equipment behind and reappearing nowhere. Even before the term missing 411 existed, these incidents formed a hidden pattern in the mountain's history. Analysts speculated that some locations possessed qualities that repeatedly confounded human presence, whether due to microclimates, magnetic anomalies, or other factors not yet understood. The continuity of such cases reinforced the notion that the mountains themselves played a silent, recurring role. Despite modern tracking, GPS, and extensive search teams, the pattern persisted, eluding explanation. Every year brought reports that fit the missing 411 profile, Isolated or paired hikers vanishing, evidence left in illogical locations, searches ending without resolution. Experts emphasized that the consistency across decades and multiple mountain ranges suggested a phenomenon beyond mere chance. Families, park authorities and law enforcement remained frustrated by the lack of closure, while investigators continue to catalogue, map and analyse, hoping patterns might one day reveal a tangible cause. The cataloguing of the missing 411 cases left more questions than answers, revealing a chilling reality. The mountains have long claimed those who tread their hidden paths in ways that defy reason, leaving behind only whispers of patterns that no human understanding has yet unravelled. The lost camera. Glacier reveals old secrets. At the edge of a receding glacier, the camera was discovered, half buried in ice that had once been a solid wall of frozen white. Mountaineers first noticed a glint beneath the melting ice, an object too angular and deliberate to be natural. Carefully extracted, it was frost-encrusted, the leather casing stiff from decades of exposure. No one knew who had left it there, or when. Yet the artifact itself carried a silent promise, that the glacier in its slow, relentless movement had preserved a fragment of history long thought lost. Experts examining the frost-crusted lens noted unusual scratches and marks along the metal edges. While some were attributed to the ice's relentless pressure, others appeared deliberate, as though someone had tried to inscribe a message or symbol before abandoning the camera. The lens glass had survived remarkably intact, offering a window into the past. Specialists handled it with extreme care, aware that even the smallest misstep could destroy the fragile balance that had preserved it through decades of harsh alpine conditions. The film, once carefully stored in a waterproof casing, had survived decades of freezing and thawing. Development revealed streaks and patches of distortion, yet enough remained to convey images of people, terrain and movement. Shadows cast across alpine ridges suggested a passage through trails now obscured by snow and time. Each frame was a puzzle, a fragment of an expedition, a frozen moment suspended in a world of ice, waiting for interpretation. The very survival of the film seemed improbable, a testament to both the glacier's cold preservation and the unpredictable cruelty of high-altitude conditions. Initial development revealed blurred figures against stark alpine ridges, captured in silent motion. One image suggested a group of hikers paused at a ridge, their posture casual, yet a second frame seemed to place them miles apart, as if time had stretched unnaturally between exposures. Mountains that were once obstacles have now become backdrops for a frozen narrative that defied clear understanding. Investigators pondered whether the images depicted ordinary hikers, a forgotten expedition, or something stranger entirely. A moment when the mountains themselves had influenced the passage of those captured in frozen frames. Forensic analysts traced the camera's origin, attempting to reconstruct the journey that led it to this glacier. Marks on the casing suggested a manufacturer from the mid-20th century, while film type and processing style indicated a narrow window of use. Cross-referencing historical expedition logs, rangers and archivists speculated on possible owners. Some names matched old missing person reports, raising the unsettling possibility that the glacier had preserved not only images, but traces of disappearances that had baffled authorities decades before. Yet despite meticulous research, no definitive connection could be confirmed. Close examination of the footage uncovered faint environmental signs pointing to a landscape that had disappeared. Trees that once lined ridgelines had fallen or disappeared entirely. Streams had shifted courses, and snowfields shown in the frames no longer existed in the same form. Small details, footprints frozen in shallow snow, the angle of a ridge, the presence of a cairn long since eroded, offered glimpses into the conditions at the time the camera was left behind. These remnants suggested that not only had the glacier preserved human artifacts, but it had also captured moments of terrain now altered, creating a temporal map of change as much as mystery. Investigators were left to wonder how many other items, hidden and waiting in ice, held equally vital fragments of the past. Mountaineers who stumbled upon the relic described a cold hush, as if the ice itself demanded silence. The surrounding crevasses and cliffs were empty, yet the sense of being observed lingered. A sudden gust of wind swept across the ice, carrying the faint sound of cracking layers, as though the glacier itself whispered fragments of memory. Those present spoke of a strange reluctance to linger, an instinctive recognition that the discovery was both extraordinary and unnerving. The artifact had emerged from its frozen tomb, but it had brought with it a weight of unanswered questions. Historical records suggested a series of expeditions or hikers who had ventured through the same area decades prior. Some logs mentioned abandoned campsites, misplaced equipment, or travellers who failed to return. While most instances were dismissed as accidents, the recovered camera offered a tangible link to these long-ago events. It raised the possibility that items lost or left behind had not been scattered randomly, but preserved intentionally or incidentally within the glacier's slow, shifting grip. The mountains, indifferent yet meticulous, had kept their secrets until the thaw revealed them. Despite modern imaging techniques, certain frames remained indecipherable, frozen in a ghostly ambiguity. Figures blurred against the bright alpine snow, trails dissolved into white, and shadows stretched across rocks in impossible angles. Analysts speculated that exposure to cold, pressure, and time had distorted the images beyond full comprehension. Yet even these partial glimpses hinted at stories untold. Expeditions interrupted, travellers separated from one another, and events recorded only by a silent witness frozen in ice. Every frame teased but none confirmed, leaving an unsettling gap between knowledge and mystery. The glacier, both preserver and eraser, had concealed these traces until the thaw revealed them. Objects once lost, paths once traversed, and moments once lived were suddenly tangible again, yet resistant to full understanding. Each artifact, each frame of film demanded interpretation without offering clarity. Scholars and rangers debated the implications. Were these simply historical curiosities, or fragments of disappearances that had never been solved? Could the glacier itself be an unintentional archive of lost souls, capturing moments and preserving them beyond human reach? The camera, its film partially developed, now resides in a small archival facility, yet its images continue to perplex experts. For every frame deciphered, another remains enigmatic, and the names of those who may have carried it remain uncertain. While the glacier recedes, revealing more secrets each year, the artifacts it releases tell stories that refuse to be fully told. Even as the ice melts and the camera's images are studied, the mountain holds its ultimate secret, keeping the past frozen where human understanding cannot reach. Mountain mass disappearances, families, groups, expeditions. Campfires were found abandoned, tents still standing, yet the families who had pitched them were nowhere. In one remote alpine valley, a weekend camping party of 5 vanished without a trace, leaving a small stove still smouldering and backpacks neatly placed by the entrance of their tents. Rangers who arrived hours later reported no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away beyond a few paces, and no disturbances in the surrounding forest. It was as if the mountains themselves had swallowed the group in an instant, leaving behind only the trappings of normal life. Rescue teams arrived to discover entire expeditions had vanished, leaving only scattered gear and footprints ending abruptly. In a separate case, a team of climbers ascending a narrow ridge had checked in the previous evening reporting ideal weather. By morning, all members were gone. Helmets, ropes, and water bottles were found along a precipitous path, yet no sign indicated whether the group had fallen, wandered off, or encountered another danger. Search parties combed the slopes for days, often facing sudden weather shifts and sheer cliffs, yet returned with nothing more than unanswered questions and a haunting sense of loss. Maps showed clear paths, but the trails had swallowed the groups without trace. In areas thought to be well charted and frequently patrolled, families and adventurers disappeared, leaving behind personal belongings meticulously arranged or scattered in ways that made no logical sense. Some items appeared miles from the nearest trail, as if relocated by unseen hands or forces. Investigators found themselves tracking gaps in evidence rather than the missing individuals themselves, cataloguing anomalies that stretched the limits of comprehension. Weather reports from the day of the disappearances revealed sudden, localized storms that appeared without warning. A sunny morning could give way to dense fog or violent gusts along the ridge, separating party members in moments. Survivors in other cases described the unsettling silence that fell during these storms, the absence of birds, wind, or any natural sound that might guide them back to safety. The combination of treacherous terrain and abrupt environmental shifts created conditions where even experienced hikers could vanish entirely. Yet the repetition of these circumstances across multiple mass disappearances suggested a pattern beyond mere misfortune. Locals spoke of hearing distant cries or seeing shadows moving along ridgelines where no one should have been. Mountain guides, hunters, and even casual hikers recounted fleeting glimpses of figures that appeared and disappeared within seconds, always coinciding with areas where entire groups had gone missing in the past. These stories, dismissed by some as folklore, gained credibility when matched with official reports of vanished families and expeditions. The whispers of witnesses added a chilling layer, implying that the mountains were not only dangerous but inhabited by an elusive, watchful presence. Historical accounts described similar mass vanishings, long forgotten yet eerily familiar. Old ranger logs from the early 20th century chronicled entire scouting parties disappearing in narrow valleys, and newspaper clippings recounted families never returning from summer hikes along isolated ridges. While the documentation was sparse, patterns matched those observed in modern disappearances: sudden vanishings, abandoned equipment, and minimal physical evidence. These accounts suggested that the phenomenon transcended modern safety precautions and persisted across generations, leaving historians and investigators alike puzzled. Several disappearances contained subtle patterns, implying that those lost had not moved haphazardly, but in an unusual, deliberate manner. Footprints sometimes formed circular or looping patterns before abruptly stopping, as if the individuals had wandered in confusion or been guided by unseen forces. Items of clothing and equipment appeared in positions that defied gravity or logic: shoes perched on boulders, backpacks neatly stacked on slopes, and children's toys left conspicuously near edges. These peculiar arrangements suggested that the disappearances were not entirely chaotic, raising questions about whether natural hazards alone could account for the events, or if something more enigmatic influenced the movement of entire groups before they vanished. Similarities in group size, age ranges, and timing left investigators searching for explanations across multiple ranges. Families of 3 or 4 were lost alongside larger expeditions of 10 or more, and the timing of disappearances often coincided with early morning or late afternoon, when light and visibility were less predictable. Terrain played a recurring role, with ridges, alpine lakes, and steep gullies appearing as focal points in multiple cases. Analysts catalogued each incident meticulously, attempting to identify the common denominator, yet the more they studied, the more the anomalies defied explanation. Even with modern GPS, tracking devices, and aerial reconnaissance, the sudden vanishings of whole groups remained unexplained. Helicopters hovered above valleys, drones scanned cliff faces, and teams of searchers combed ridgelines with trained dogs, yet frequently returned empty-handed. In some cases, dogs refused to follow trails that should have been obvious, or became agitated near areas where the missing were last seen. The lack of consistent evidence and the failure of advanced technology only amplified the sense of mystery, suggesting that these vanishings were not just accidents, but events that transcended conventional understanding. Search dogs returned confused or unresponsive, unable to follow scents that should have been obvious. Rangers noted that in several mass disappearance cases, the dogs would circle abandoned campsites or trails before ultimately giving up, their behaviour reflecting the baffling absence of a scent trail that normally would have led to the missing. Experts speculated that unique environmental factors, temperature inversions, wind currents, or other anomalies, might have played a role, yet none could account fully for the suddenness and frequency of the disappearances. The animals' reactions became another eerie element in a pattern otherwise devoid of explanation. The magnitude of these disappearances challenged every assumption about safety in the mountains. The vanishings of families, groups, and expeditions were not isolated tragedies. They were echoes of a persistent and unresolved enigma. Each case left behind only fragments, gear, footprints, or abandoned campsites, and the repeated recurrence across decades and regions suggested a force or phenomenon indifferent to human preparation, skill, or vigilance. The mountains, majestic and alluring, had claimed entire parties without warning, leaving investigators, locals, and future hikers to wonder if anyone who enters certain ridges ever truly returns. The valleys and peaks remain untouched by sound, keeping the lost concealed in a mystery that has eluded every search. Mountain structures that never were. Old survey maps indicated a cabin perched along a ridge that modern explorers cannot find. Cartographers in the early 20th century had marked it with precise coordinates, yet every subsequent expedition, whether on the foot or by air, has failed to locate its foundations. Accounts of the cabin included detailed notes about its stone chimney, timber framing, and a small veranda overlooking the valley below. When modern hikers attempt to follow the same route, the ridge seems barren, stripped of the structure that history insists once existed, leaving only wind and rock to fill its absence. Photographs from the early 20th century captured a lodge now absent from the landscape. Black and white images show a multi-story building surrounded by snow-laden pines, smoke curling from its chimney. The photographer's notes described the lodge as a haven for travellers and mountaineers, yet when the coordinates were retraced decades later, the forest had reclaimed the terrain. No foundation stones remain, no remnants of footpaths, and even the tree line appears subtly altered, as if the land itself has erased the structure from memory. Residents recall trails and footbridges that seem to vanish when retraced. Elders speak of a narrow wooden bridge crossing a swift alpine stream, leading to a cluster of cabins or lodges that no longer appear on modern maps. Hikers who follow the described route report sudden gaps where paths once continued, and logs, rocks and vegetation form natural obstacles in the exact spots locals remember crossing. These recollections, passed down through generations, hint at a subtle collision between lived experience and cartographic reality, where memory and topography diverge in ways difficult to reconcile. Rangers attempting to reconcile historical records with GPS coordinates discovered perplexing gaps. Detailed government surveys from the 1920s and 1930s noted numerous structures, yet modern topographical mapping shows no evidence of foundations or disturbances in soil. Field teams meticulously combed ridges, valleys, and forested slopes, often finding depressions or flattened ground, but nothing conclusively identifiable as human construction. Each attempt to locate the lodges raised further questions. Were these structures deliberately dismantled, swallowed by natural processes, or did they never exist in the way the records implied? Expedition journals described cabins complete with furnishings, yet none remained to be seen. Mountaineers' diaries detail fireplaces, beds, tables, and cookware, giving the impression of lived-in homes tucked into the wilderness. Travellers mention meals shared in warmth, evenings spent by the fire, and the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. Modern investigations reveal no trace of these interiors or the objects within them, even soil analysis and metal detection yield inconclusive results, deepening the sense that the cabins have been erased, not merely forgotten, but removed entirely from the landscape. Satellite imagery fails to show foundations or remnants where lodges were once documented. Analysts cross-referenced aerial photographs with early maps, noting that coordinates for several buildings corresponded to empty slopes, dense forests, or rock-strewn ridges. No patterns of human construction were evident, and subtle terrain changes appeared inconsistent with historical descriptions. Some researchers proposed that environmental shifts, erosion, avalanches, or glacial movement might explain partial disappearance, yet the complete absence of materials and structural remnants suggested a phenomenon that surpassed simple natural alteration. From time to time, explorers uncover fragments suggesting former habitation, though each piece raises more questions than it resolves. A single rusted hinge, a splintered beam, or a fragment of painted wood might appear in a valley where a lodge was documented, yet none of the pieces correspond to one another or suggest a complete structure. Soil analysis sometimes detects traces of hearths or concentrated ash, but no coherent floor plan emerges. These ephemeral remnants seem deliberately scattered, as though memory and matter have been fractured, preserving just enough evidence to hint at what once existed, yet denying any definitive reconstruction. Stories whisper of lodges that appear for a moment, then vanish into fog or forest. Hikers and hunters report catching sight of wooden walls or sloping roofs through mist, only for them to dissolve when approached. Some claim to hear footsteps, the creak of floorboards, or laughter emanating from empty clearings. Whether these are tricks of light, memory, or imagination is impossible to confirm, yet the recurrence of such accounts across decades and locations has lent credibility to the legend. The mountains, it seems, have a way of concealing the familiar and presenting it only fleetingly. Historical records contradict modern maps, leaving researchers to question what truly existed. Government surveys, private journals, and early guidebooks describe trails, cabins, and lodges in overlapping yet inconsistent locations. Coordinates and elevations sometimes vary by hundreds of meters, and descriptions of terrain shift subtly between sources. These inconsistencies frustrate attempts at verification, suggesting either errors in documentation or a more profound alteration of the landscape over time. The further investigators dig, the less certain they become of whether the lodges were physical structures, products of misrecorded memory, or phenomena beyond conventional understanding. Even those who once visited these places speak of subtle shifts, as if memory and geography diverged. Survivors of expeditions recount landmarks that seemed familiar one day, yet were rearranged or absent on subsequent visits. A boulder that once marked a path may vanish entirely, and a tree used for orientation may appear miles away. These recollections, though subjective, echo across generations of mountaineers and rangers, suggesting that the mountains themselves manipulate perception, or that the structures left in memory may exist in a space between reality and imagination. The mystery of these vanishing lodges, cabins, and trails persists despite modern mapping, GPS, and field surveys. Some have proposed that glacial movement, erosion, or forest regrowth accounts for partial disappearance, yet the consistency of eyewitness accounts, photographs, and journal entries defies simple explanation. The structures are at once remembered and missing, existing in records, photos, and stories, yet absent when sought. The mountains hold their secrets in silence, and the places that once offered refuge now leave only a haunting question in their wake. At times, old letters and diaries surface, describing evenings spent inside these vanished lodges, the warmth of a fire, the smell of cooking, or the comfort of a sturdy roof over weary shoulders. The writers speak with certainty, recounting rooms, furniture, and even neighbours who shared the remote peaks, yet when investigators attempt to verify these accounts, nothing corresponds with the terrain. It is as if memory has preserved a place that the world itself refuses to reveal, a testament to a landscape that keeps its past in whispers, visible only to those who once believed it existed. Even as researchers retrace maps and cross-reference every historical account, the lodges remain elusive, standing in memory but disappearing from the world. The ridge that whispers, legends, myths, and lost souls. A dense fog often descends on the ridge, cloaking the peaks in a spectral veil. Travellers speak of sudden whiteouts that appear without warning, reducing visibility to mere feet while muffling all natural sound. The fog moves like a living entity, curling around crags and valleys, shaping itself into fleeting forms that vanish as quickly as they appear. Hikers venturing along the ridge often report that familiar landmarks disappear within minutes, replaced by terrain that feels at once familiar and alien, a liminal space between memory and reality. Locals speak of whispers carried on the wind, voices with no visible source. Some claim to hear faint calls, laughter, or fragmented sentences that seem to originate from nowhere, yet echo through the gullies. These murmurs often coincide with areas where travellers have gone missing, and the stories persist across generations, lending the ridge a reputation as a place where the living and the departed brush against one another. Elders caution that hearing the whispers is a warning, a signal to turn back before the mountain claims yet another life. Hikers report sudden chills and the feeling of being watched along narrow ledges. Several mountaineers have described a sensation of eyes tracking them, of pressure in the air that cannot be explained by weather or wind. Some have glimpsed fleeting shapes moving along cliffs or in the tree line, only to find the space empty when they look directly. These encounters, brief and unsettling, leave a lingering unease that persists long after the ridge has been abandoned for the day. Even experienced guides acknowledge the ridge's uncanny aura, often avoiding certain paths without giving explicit reasons to their clients. Old diaries recount travellers who vanished after glimpsing figures at dawn. In journals preserved in local historical societies, entries detail climbers who reported distant silhouettes or shadowed forms moving along ridgelines in the early morning mist. Within days, these travellers disappeared without a trace, leaving equipment or personal belongings behind, often in positions that suggested no struggle or natural accident. The stories, though anecdotal, mirror the disappearances documented in search and rescue logs, creating a blurred line between folklore and recorded mystery. The ridge has long been associated with spirits, omens, and untimely disappearances. Folktales passed down through generations tell of wandering souls, guardians of the peaks, or entities that lead travellers astray. Some speak of a spectral figure appearing at twilight, pointing toward paths that do not exist, or of glowing lights hovering over cliffs that shift when approached. These legends, though steeped in myth, frequently intersect with real disappearances, suggesting that the ridge's mysterious reputation may have arisen from more than imagination alone. Rangers occasionally find personal belongings placed as if left behind in haste. A backpack on a narrow ledge, a shoe atop a boulder, or a jacket draped over a fallen tree may appear with no signs of struggle, yet no person is nearby. These items are sometimes discovered months after the initial disappearance, perfectly preserved in position despite exposure to snow, rain, and wind. The arrangement of these belongings implies an intentional or guided motion, a subtle choreography that defies explanation and deepens the ridge's eerie mystique. Faint signs of campfires and scattered footprints occasionally emerge in places no one would expect, far from any recognised trail or campsite. Ash from these fires shows signs of recent combustion, yet no tracks lead to or from the area, and steep slopes or dense undergrowth make access impractical. Rangers and investigators who attempt to follow the footprints find them ending abruptly, as if the ridge itself has swallowed the individuals. These fleeting traces suggest that the ridge is not merely the backdrop for legend, but a space where the movement of those who traverse it can become unpredictable, leaving behind tantalizing evidence that refuses explanation. Echoes bounce strangely off cliffs, amplifying faint cries or footsteps that seem almost human. Observers report that sounds travel unpredictably along ridges, cliffs, and gullies, creating the impression of voices just beyond reach. Even the most familiar terrain can distort audio perception, making a lone shout appear as if multiplied, reversed, or emanating from a location that is impossible to reach. This phenomenon has confused search parties, led to false trails, and contributed to the ridge's reputation as a place where sensory experience cannot be fully trusted. Stories passed down for generations hint at a place where time and direction become uncertain. Travellers describe feeling hours pass in what seem like minutes, or suddenly emerging on slopes they had already crossed. Compasses and GPS devices sometimes behave erratically, and maps fail to accurately represent the ridge's contours. These accounts, though anecdotal, are consistent across decades, suggesting that the ridge itself may act as a space where conventional rules of navigation, time, and perception are suspended, further complicating search efforts and reinforcing the legends. Even those who approach with caution often leave with a lingering sense that the ridge watches. Climbers speak of subtle shifts in terrain, shadows that align unnaturally with their path, or a quiet awareness that they are not alone. The ridge seems to hold its secrets tightly, allowing only glimpses of what lies within fog, shadow, and myth. Every step taken along the crags is both a journey into the natural world and a passage into the stories, whispers, and memories embedded in its slopes. Without warning, objects have been seen moving by hikers along the trail. A trekking pole left leaning against a rock may appear several feet away upon return. Water bottles vanish from backpacks only to be found perched on ledges far above the trail. Even small items like buttons or stones seem displaced when the ridge is revisited, as if an unseen hand rearranges the environment in subtle ways. These small but persistent anomalies leave climbers with the impression that the ridge is not only alive in legend, but responsive, watching, and sometimes interacting with those who dare traverse its heights. Across decades, disappearances and strange encounters have intertwined with folklore, creating a layered history where evidence, myth, and memory converge. Missing hikers, spectral sightings, and unexplainable phenomena are catalogued alongside the tales passed from elder to younger generations. Maps, photographs, and journals provide only partial clarity, leaving gaps filled by speculation and fear. The ridge exists simultaneously in the physical world and in the collective imagination of those who've crossed it, a threshold where the unexplained is woven seamlessly into everyday memory. No matter how meticulously the ridge is mapped, monitored, or explored, it continues to guard its secrets, preserving the stories of those who vanished and the whispers of the unseen.